I worked 16 hours a day to keep a roof over our children's heads, while my husband stayed home playing the role of the misunderstood genius. For years, I ignored every red flag, swallowing his empty promises of a startup empire that never materialized. I told myself patience was a virtue and that his big break was always just around the corner. But the night I came home completely exhausted to find an $80,000 truck sitting arrogantly in my driveway, I finally stopped being the blindly supportive wife. Instead of screaming until my throat gave out, I made a single, carefully considered phone call that systematically and permanently dismantled his entire carefully constructed life. My name is Olivia, and I am 34 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. And if you have ever had to break free from a partner who financially and emotionally exploited you, hit subscribe. Trust me, you will absolutely want to hear how I served him the ultimate reality check he never saw coming. It was 11:30 on a Tuesday night. My hands gripped the steering wheel of my 10-year-old sedan so hard my knuckles had gone completely white. I had just finished a brutal 16-hour double shift that had left every muscle in my body screaming for rest. By day, I was a regional finance manager for a medical supply company, overseeing and managing complex corporate accounts worth millions. By night, I moonlighted as a freelance bookkeeper, taking on private clients one after another just to ensure we could afford the mortgage, keep the lights on, and put food on the table for our children. My husband, Derek, who was 36, had not held a steady job in 3 full years. He called himself a startup founder with visionary ideas ahead of their time. I called him a man who spent his days endlessly scrolling through social media and complaining bitterly that corporate America simply did not understand or appreciate his genius. As I turned slowly onto our quiet suburban street, all I wanted was to kick off my heels, quietly check on our twin toddlers, who were hopefully fast asleep, and collapse face first into bed. But as I pulled up to my house, my headlights cut through the darkness and illuminated a massive obstruction blocking the entire driveway. I slammed on the brakes, my heart leaping violently into my throat. Sitting right in the middle of my driveway was a brand new, aggressively shiny midnight black heavy-duty luxury truck. The dealership plates were still bolted firmly to the back, and the gleaming chrome rims reflected the amber glow of the streetlights like a showroom display. This was not just a vehicle. It was an $80,000 status symbol designed to broadcast ego rather than serve any practical purpose. I stepped out of my car, the crisp night air biting sharply through my thin work blazer. Confusion washed over me immediately, followed in rapid succession by a rising tide of cold panic. Whose truck was this? Why on earth was it parked directly at my house? That is when I heard the heavy, thudding bass of hip-hop music pumping aggressively from the backyard. I could already smell the distinct, unmistakable aroma of expensive steak sizzling on a charcoal grill, the smoke drifting lazily over the fence. I walked carefully around the side of the house, my sensible work heels sinking slightly into the soft evening grass with each step. When I finally pushed open the wooden gate to the backyard, the scene that greeted me made my blood run ice cold. The patio was lit up like a fraternity house on a Friday night with no sign of it winding down. Empty beer cans littered the outdoor glass table I had spent an entire hour carefully cleaning just the weekend before. Standing at the grill, holding a pair of tongs like a royal scepter, was Derek. He was wearing a brand new, clearly expensive designer polo shirt that I had most definitely never purchased for him. Surrounding him were 3 of his closest buddies, all men in their late 30s, who seemed to share Derek's deep, personal allergy to stable employment and basic adult responsibility. They were laughing loudly, clinking expensive craft beer bottles together, entirely without a care in the world. Derek turned and spotted me standing frozen at the gate. There was no guilt in his eyes, There was not even the faintest flicker of hesitation or shame. Instead, he flashed a wide, outrageously arrogant smile and threw his arms open dramatically. "Look who finally decided to join us," Derek announced loudly, making absolutely certain his friends could hear every syllable. "The future chief financial officer of my empire." His friends chuckled on cue, looking me up and down in my wrinkled work suit as though I were an amusing curiosity rather than the woman who paid for every single thing they were currently enjoying. I stood there, a potent mixture of pure exhaustion and profound disbelief, anchoring my feet to the cold patio stones. "Derek, what exactly is going on here?" I asked, my voice pulled tight like a wire about to snap. "Whose massive truck is blocking my driveway?" Derek waved his tongs dismissively through the warm night air. "Oh, do not worry about that, babe. That is just a minor business expense. You have to look the part to get serious investors on board. Image is everything in the tech world." He paused for barely a second before walking toward me, not to kiss me hello or ask how my grueling 16-hour workday had gone, but to shove an empty ceramic bowl directly into my exhausted hands. "The guys and I are starving," he commanded, his tone completely and deliberately stripped of any warmth or respect. "The steaks are taking too long. Run into the kitchen and whip up a couple of large trays of those loaded nachos you make, extra jalapenos. My future board of directors needs fuel for our brainstorming session." I stared down at the empty bowl resting in my hands. A board of directors? These men could not direct themselves out of a paper bag on a clear day, let alone successfully run a technology company. My feet ached with a deep bone-level fatigue. My eyes burned raw from staring at spreadsheets all day long. And my husband was standing here, ordering me to play short-order cook at nearly midnight for his circle of unemployed friends. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of his request echoed in my ears over the pounding music. I looked slowly from the bowl up to Derek's smug, expectant face, and then out past him toward the driveway where that massive, expensive truck sat gleaming in the dark like a monument to his delusion. A dangerous and deeply icy calm began to settle over my chest, spreading outward like frost across glass. I did not throw the bowl. I did not raise my voice or yell. I simply tightened my grip on the ceramic edge and turned deliberately toward the back door of the house. I stepped into the kitchen and let the heavy glass sliding door click firmly shut behind me. The thumping bass from the backyard instantly muffled itself into a distant, dull vibration felt more through the floorboards than heard. I set the empty ceramic bowl on the granite counter with a sharp, decisive clatter. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the coursing adrenaline of pure, white-hot outrage. I needed a single moment to breathe and collect myself before I figured out my next move. I pulled my phone from my blazer pocket, intending only to check the time. It was 11:40. I suddenly remembered that the electric bill was due precisely at midnight, and with Derek casually blowing through our household budget on premium steaks and imported craft beer for his unemployed entourage, I needed to verify that the auto-pay would not bounce and leave us in the dark. I opened my mobile banking app, the bright screen stinging my already overtired eyes. I navigated to our joint checking account. The balance was a pitiful, insulting $200. I let out a long, heavy sigh and tapped the screen to switch over to my personal savings account so I could quietly transfer enough funds to cover the utility bill. But as the account overview page finished loading, my eyes snagged on a discrepancy buried in the third row. It was the line item for the 529 college savings plan I had carefully established for our twins, Leo and Mia. The balance read $0. I blinked hard and rubbed my eyes, assuming the app was glitching. The servers sometimes ran routine maintenance late at night and displayed incorrect figures. I swiped down firmly to force a refresh. The loading wheel spun for 2 agonizing, interminable seconds before the screen finally settled. $0. A cold sweat broke out instantly across the back of my neck. I tapped directly into the 529 account portfolio, drilling down into the detailed view. The entire transaction history was completely blank, wiped clean. Panic, sharp and suffocating, seized my chest with both hands. I immediately opened my mobile web browser and navigated directly to the dedicated investment portal for the college fund. I entered my username carefully and typed in the password I had used without incident for the past 5 years. Error. Incorrect password. I typed it again, slower this time, making absolutely certain my trembling fingers pressed the correct keys. Error. Account locked due to suspicious activity or changed credentials. I immediately switched over to my email app and frantically typed the name of the investment firm into the search bar. I scrolled past months of routine newsletters and standard policy updates until I found a cluster of automated notification emails from Tuesday morning, buried and hidden away inside my deleted folder. Someone had deliberately and manually moved them there to keep them out of sight. I tapped the first one. Password change request initiated. I tapped the second. Email address updated successfully. I tapped the third, and the words on the screen made my stomach drop with violent, nauseating force. Withdrawal complete. $45,000 has been transferred to an external account. I braced both hands flat against the kitchen island so I would not crumple to the floor. $45,000. It was every single penny I had painstakingly saved since the day I found out I was pregnant with the twins. My mind raced backward through time, flashing through the origin of every dollar in that account. I opened my digital archive of bank statements, pulling up the PDF stretching back 5 years. I scrolled frantically through page after page, the numbers blurring together into a timeline written entirely in my own exhaustion. There was the $200 deposit from January 3 years ago. Money I had earned auditing the books for a small local bakery on a Sunday afternoon, while Derek sat on the couch watching football. There was the $500 deposit from last November, the holiday bonus from the medical supply company that I had chosen to invest rather than spend on the new winter coat I genuinely needed. Line after line, deposit after deposit, ranging from $50 to $1,000, each one representing a missed weekend, a late night stretched impossibly long, a double shift taken without complaint. I had worked myself down to the bone, staring at spreadsheets until my vision swam and doubled, all to make absolutely certain that Leo and Mia would never have to take out predatory student loans when they turned 18. And in a single afternoon, without a word to me, it was entirely gone. I navigated back to the joint checking account history and dug deeper, expanding every transaction detail from the past 48 hours. There it was, an incoming transfer of $45,000 from the college fund deposited on Tuesday afternoon. Exactly 2 hours later, an outgoing wire transfer for the precise same amount. The recipient name was perfectly, devastatingly clear. It was the luxury auto dealership located across town. The $80,000 truck sitting in my driveway had not been purchased with any investor capital or business funding. Derek had used his own children's entire financial future as a down payment for his ego. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt far too thin to breathe properly. He had logged into my personal computer, accessed my secure saved passwords, bypassed every security question, and completely wiped out 5 years of my blood, sweat, and sacrifice. He had done all of this, every calculated, deliberate step, to buy a truck designed to impress a group of unemployed men drinking beer on my patio. The sliding glass door rattled loudly on its tracks, shattering the heavy silence of the kitchen. Derek strolled casually inside, an empty beer bottle dangling from his fingers as though nothing in the world could possibly be wrong. Right behind him, wiping her hands carelessly on one of my expensive decorative kitchen towels, was his mother, Barbara. She had apparently let herself in through the front door while I was standing in the kitchen having my quiet, private panic attack. Barbara lived a mere 10 minutes away and had long treated my home as her personal country club, dropping by unannounced with startling regularity to personally ensure that I was keeping her precious son sufficiently comfortable and catered to. Derek frowned at the empty counter with immediate displeasure. He asked loudly where the nachos were, complaining that the guys were getting restless outside and that the wait was becoming embarrassing. I did not move toward the pantry. I did not reach for a cutting board or so much as look at a knife. I simply picked up my phone with both hands, turned the screen brightness all the way to maximum, and held it up directly in front of his face, so the glaring $0 balance was impossible to ignore or look away from. I asked him, in a voice that was eerily, deliberately calm and entirely devoid of the hysterical pitch he was almost certainly expecting, exactly where the $45,000 from our twins' college fund had gone. Derek rolled his eyes with theatrical exhaustion and sighed loudly, performing the weary patience of a man who had simply been asked to take out the recycling. He told me to relax, insisting the money was not gone at all, but merely reallocated to a higher purpose. He admitted freely that he had transferred it into the joint account and then wired it directly to the luxury dealership. You cannot park a 10-year-old sedan in the driveway when you are inviting high-net-worth individuals over to pitch a tech startup, he said with absolute conviction. It screams desperation before you even open your mouth. He insisted with complete seriousness that he required an executive vehicle to project the image of success that serious investors expected to see. Before I could even begin to process the staggering, almost beautiful delusion of categorizing a lifted pickup truck as an executive vehicle, Barbara stepped directly and deliberately between us. She crossed her arms tightly, her oversized diamond rings glinting sharply under the pendant lights I had personally selected and paid for. She snapped at me to stop raising my voice at her son, despite the fact that I had been speaking at a perfectly measured, conversational volume throughout the entire exchange. He is the head of this household, she declared with absolute authority, and he makes the executive decisions. She announced that if he determined he needed a luxury truck to secure angel investors, then he clearly needed that truck. According to her considered opinion, I should in fact have been actively thanking him for taking the bold initiative to elevate our family's image and status. Thanking him. I repeated the two words slowly and deliberately to myself, tasting the absolute staggering absurdity of them on my tongue. I looked directly at Barbara and calmly laid out the precise facts of what had actually occurred. He had hacked into my secure investment portal. He had changed all the passwords and updated the recovery email without my knowledge or consent. He had drained 5 full years of savings that I alone had earned, working consecutive double shifts while he slept until noon. He had taken his own children's college money to buy himself a toy. Those were not opinions. Those were documented, traceable, prosecutable facts. Derek interjected immediately, grabbing a handful of grapes from the fruit bowl on the counter and tossing one lazily into his mouth as though this were a casual after-dinner conversation. He argued that it was not a toy in any meaningful sense, but a vital and strategic business expense. He promised confidently that once he successfully secured funding for his APIs, which was imminent, he assured me, he would replace every single dollar and very likely double it through his returns. He accused me of catastrophically overreacting to what was, in his professional assessment, nothing more than a temporary cash flow adjustment. Barbara nodded vigorously and enthusiastically in agreement, stepping several paces closer to me with an expression of pure, undisguised condescension arranged carefully on her face. She sneered that this moment was precisely why Derek was the visionary, and I was simply the bookkeeper. She accused me directly of harboring a small, impoverished mindset. The kind of limited thinking that would always keep people like me exactly where we were. You sit at a desk all day, punching numbers on a calculator and counting pennies, she said, with the confidence of someone who had not held employment since the late 90s. While my son is out here doing the hard, important work of building an empire. You simply do not understand how high-level business actually operates. She concluded, as she always did, with her favorite well-worn cliché: you have to spend money to make money. I stared at her in silence. The woman who had not held a single paying job since the late 90s was standing in my kitchen, in front of my pendant lights, drinking coffee made with my beans, lecturing me about high-level business strategy and financial vision. I shifted my gaze to Derek, the visionary, who was at that precise moment wiping a streak of grape juice casually onto the sleeve of his brand-new stolen money polo shirt. He looked entirely, serenely unbothered by the objective reality that he had just committed a serious act of financial fraud against his own children. He felt not merely justified but righteous, because his mother had spent the entirety of his adult life enthusiastically validating his worst possible impulses and insulating him from every consequence. Barbara continued her tirade, her voice dropping into a register of exaggerated, performative pity. She claimed with genuine conviction that the reason I worked two demanding jobs was entirely because I had chosen, consciously and willfully, to be a martyr. She said that if I had actually supported my husband properly, rather than constantly nagging and undermining him, his stress levels might have been manageable enough for him to have launched a successful company years ago. But no, she said, I always had to make him feel small, always had to withhold my belief and enthusiasm, always had to refuse him the room to lead. He was leading now, she informed me, and I needed to accept that and adjust my attitude accordingly. Furthermore, she added, as her absolute finishing blow, those children did not need $45,000 sitting uselessly in a bank account earning minimal interest when their father was standing on the very edge of becoming a multimillionaire. The sheer concentrated toxicity saturating the kitchen air at that moment was genuinely suffocating. Any ordinary wife might have screamed herself hoarse. Any ordinary mother might have swept every item off the granite island onto the floor in a single furious motion. But the anger burning inside me had long since passed the explosive stage. It had burned completely through that phase and crystallized on the other side into something altogether different. Something cold, sharp, geometrically precise, and entirely calculated. They genuinely believed I was nothing more than a small-minded bookkeeper whose only skill was counting other people's money. They interpreted my silence as surrender and defeat. They had absolutely no idea that my professional life was built on forensic financial tracking, on identifying sophisticated corporate fraud, and on systematically and legally dismantling people who believed they could embezzle funds and walk away without consequences. That was not my hobby, that was my career. And I was very, very good at it. Derek clapped his hands together with obvious satisfaction, completely and catastrophically misreading my sustained silence as total capitulation. He announced cheerfully that he was glad we had finally cleared all of that up, and then demanded the nachos again with renewed energy, noting that his friends had been patient long enough. I looked at my husband. I looked at him slowly and carefully, at his arrogant posture, his designer shirt purchased with money stolen from his sleeping children, and the absolute, unshakable certainty in his eyes that I would simply submit, cry quietly into my pillow, and be back in line by morning as I had been so many times before. I tilted my head very slightly to one side, and a slow, genuinely glacial smile spread across my face. I am not going to argue with you about any of this, Derek, I said, my voice smooth and even as polished glass. You are absolutely right. You are the visionary. You needed an executive vehicle. I completely understand. Derek blinked. His shoulders, which had been braced for another round of conflict, visibly relaxed. The familiar smug smirk returned to his lips like an old friend coming home. He thought he had broken me. He truly believed that Barbara's lecture had successfully put me back in my designated place. Exactly, he said, puffing out his chest with enormous self-satisfaction. I am glad you are finally seeing the bigger picture. When this app launches, you will realize this was genuinely the best single investment we ever made as a family. I stepped aside gracefully and gestured toward the back door where the music was still playing loudly out into the neighborhood. Go on, I told him, holding my cold smile perfectly, effortlessly in place. Your board of directors is waiting for you. Enjoy the truck, Derek. Enjoy absolutely every single second of it. He gave me a long, lingering look, something uncertain flickering briefly behind his eyes, his instincts warning him that something was fundamentally off about my sudden serenity. But his ego, as it always did, moved in swiftly and overrode his intuition before it could deliver its message. He pushed the glass door open with his shoulder and walked out into the warm night, immediately greeted by the loud, enthusiastic cheers of his friends. I stood alone in the quiet hallway and listened to them celebrate a man who had, without realizing it, just signed his own comprehensive financial death warrant. The alarm clock detonated at 6 o'clock in the morning, dragging me up from a restless, broken 3 hours of sleep. My body ached in ways that had become deeply familiar from years of double shifts, but my mind was sharper, clearer, and more focused than it had been in a very long time, possibly years. I climbed out of bed with purpose, dressed the twins with practiced efficiency, and fed them their morning oatmeal while they chattered happily about their toy dinosaurs. Leo and Mia were blissfully, mercifully unaware of the financial earthquake that had struck the foundation of our family the night before. I packed their little backpacks with the same care I always did, kissed their warm foreheads, and dropped them safely at daycare before heading back to the house to collect my work laptop and make my first call of the day. When I walked back into the kitchen at 8:30, the stale, sour smell of warm beer and cigar smoke still hung stubbornly in the air from the previous night's patio celebration. Derek was finally awake. He sauntered down the wooden staircase wearing expensive silk pajama pants, aggressively rubbing his temples as though he were the one carrying the crushing weight of the world on his shoulders. He poured himself a large mug from the pot of coffee I had already brewed, and slumped heavily onto a bar stool at the kitchen island with the energy of a man profoundly wronged by Tuesday. There was not a single trace of remorse anywhere on his face or in his posture. No apology for stealing $45,000 from his children's future. No acknowledgement of the way he had treated me in front of his friends the night before. Instead of a good morning, he slid a folded piece of notebook paper deliberately across the granite countertop in my direction. I need you to clear your entire schedule for this Friday night, he announced without preamble, his voice still rough and raspy from the craft beer hangover he had thoroughly earned. Cancel your bookkeeping clients. Call out of your corporate job if you absolutely have to. We are hosting a pitch dinner right here in the dining room. I stared at the folded paper without touching it. A pitch dinner, I repeated, my voice completely flat. Yes, Derek said, leaning forward with a sudden burst of manufactured executive energy. A major angel investor is coming over personally. This man is a genuine heavyweight in the tech industry. He funds multi-million-dollar startups before most people finish their morning coffee. I finally got his full attention, and I intend to pitch my app over a private, intimate home dinner. It demonstrates both confidence and authentic personal touch. It sets me apart from every other founder knocking on his door. I reached out and unfolded the piece of notebook paper. It was a grocery list written in his characteristically messy, sprawling handwriting. But it read, less like a grocery list and more like the procurement inventory for a Michelin-starred restaurant preparing for a critic's visit. Wagyu beef ribeyes, imported Italian truffle oil, Spanish saffron, 3 specific varieties of artisanal French cheese, fresh oysters on ice. 2 bottles of a very specific red wine that I knew from professional experience cost well over $200 each. "I expect a proper 5-course gourmet meal," Derek commanded, taking a long, loud sip of his coffee. "And presentation matters enormously here, Olivia. Do not just put the food on the plates the way you do on a regular weeknight. I need you to serve us course by course, properly timed, like a professional. I need this investor to walk into my home and immediately see that my personal life is organized, elegant, and luxurious. It projects stability and success. It tells him I am a man who has already arrived." I read down the list a second time, a bitter laugh rising quietly in my throat before I forced it back down. He was treating me with the casual authority of a man who had hired a personal servant, except he had not hired me. He had married me, and somewhere along the way had decided those 2 things were interchangeable. I looked up from the paper and met his bloodshot, utterly unapologetic eyes. "Derek," I said slowly, keeping my voice perfectly level and controlled. "You drained our savings account yesterday. The joint checking account has exactly $200 in it right now. How exactly do you expect me to pay for Wagyu beef and imported Italian truffles?" He waved his hand dismissively through the air, an irritated sigh escaping through his nose, as though I had asked him to explain basic arithmetic to a child. "Just put it on your personal credit cards. Figure it out. Consider it a strategic investment in our family's future." He leaned back on his bar stool with the posture of a man who had never once felt the weight of a bill. "Once this investor signs a term sheet, I will pay off your little credit card balances within a week. Do not make a mountain out of a molehill." He was so utterly, catastrophically blind to reality. He had absolutely no idea that Jamal had already locked down and frozen my personal credit profiles the night before, creating an impenetrable wall of protection against any further financial sabotage Derek might attempt. But I did not tell him that. I did not point out the breathtaking insanity of asking a woman working 2 demanding jobs to personally finance a luxury dinner party for the man who had just robbed her own children of their educational future. I simply folded the piece of notebook paper with deliberate care and slipped it into the front pocket of my work blazer. "I will take care of the dinner on Friday," I told him, my tone completely drained of emotion, flat and cooperative as still water. "I will make sure everything is exactly what you deserve." Derek smiled, a wide, deeply self-satisfied grin that made my stomach turn over slowly. "Good," he said, patting the countertop twice with an open palm as though rewarding a well-trained dog. "I am glad you are finally acting like a supportive partner. Just stay out of the way while we talk business. You can wait in the kitchen between courses." I turned my back to him and reached for my laptop bag without another word. I had just agreed to play the obedient, silent wife. I had agreed to cook his ridiculous 5-course gourmet meal and serve him and his associates like a personal catering staff. Because what Derek did not know, what he could not possibly have imagined in his most paranoid moment, was that Friday night was not going to be a pitch dinner. It was going to be an execution. I drove to my corporate office that morning wrapped in a bizarre, crystalline sense of clarity. The entire workday felt less like a Wednesday and more like a tightly wound countdown clock. Between approving quarterly budget reports and managing the day-to-day operations of my finance team, I sent carefully worded messages to Jamal through a secure encrypted messaging application. He confirmed he was actively pulling and cataloging the complete digital transaction logs and asked me to meet him for lunch the following day at a location we agreed upon. I confirmed the meeting, shut my laptop at exactly 5 o'clock, and headed home with a decisiveness I had not felt in years. Normally, the drive back to the suburbs was shadowed by a familiar, low-level dread, a quiet anxiety about what mood Derek might be in when I opened the front door, what new crisis or complaint was waiting for me on the other side. Today, driving home felt entirely different. I felt nothing but cold, focused anticipation. When I unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer, however, my sharp anticipation quickly morphed into a fresh wave of genuine disbelief. The first thing I noticed was the mountain of luggage. 3 enormous hard-shell suitcases were stacked haphazardly against the entryway console table, leaning slightly as though they had been dropped with impatience rather than placed with any care. I recognized them instantly. They belonged to Barbara. Before I could even begin to process why her luggage was piled inside my house, a loud scraping sound echoed from the living room, furniture being dragged across hardwood with complete disregard for the floors beneath it. I walked past the base of the stairs and stopped completely dead in my tracks. The entire layout of the main floor had been dramatically and unilaterally altered. My favorite reading chair, the one I had bought with my very first promotion bonus as a private gift to myself, had been shoved carelessly and dismissively into a dark corner beside the bookcase. The decorative area rugs had been rolled up and leaned against the wall. Standing in the precise center of the stripped living room, pointing aggressively at various sections of the walls, was my mother-in-law. Barbara turned around when she heard my footsteps approaching. She did not look remotely like a guest dropping by for a brief social visit. She was wearing soft, worn house slippers and had a yellow measuring tape draped around her neck like a contractor surveying a job site. "I am moving in," she announced, not as a question or a request or even an opening for discussion, but as an absolute and irrevocable decree. "Do not look so shocked, Olivia. Someone with actual taste and organizational capacity has to supervise the preparations for Friday night." I stared at her, then slowly down at her slippers, then back up at her face. "Moving in. You live 10 minutes away," I said, spacing the words out with deliberate patience. Barbara waved her hand, dismissing my entirely reasonable observation with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent decades never having to justify herself. 10 minutes is far too long a commute when there is an executive-level event to properly coordinate. Derek is on the very verge of a multi-million-dollar breakthrough. He requires a serene, perfectly organized, and impeccably curated environment to perform at his best. Frankly, I cannot trust you to provide that on your own. You are always so perpetually distracted with your little accounting side hustles. I will be staying in the guest room permanently until the startup fully launches and Derek can afford to purchase a proper estate. She said the last word with a satisfied lift of her chin. Permanently. The sheer breath-stealing audacity of that single word hung in the air between us like smoke. She was planning to comfortably and indefinitely nest inside my home, the home whose mortgage I alone paid every single month, in order to wait for an imaginary financial windfall funded entirely by my children's stolen college savings. The full absurdity of the arrangement was almost architectural in its construction. I took a slow, measured breath and let my eyes move carefully around the room. That was when I noticed the heavy black garbage bag sitting beside the cold fireplace. Protruding from the open top of the bag was the edge of a framed photograph, along with several of my favorite decorative throw pillows and the custom hand-knitted blanket my sister Nora had made lovingly for the twins during my pregnancy. My stomach tightened instantly. I crossed the room and reached into the bag, pulling the frame out carefully with both hands. It was a photograph of my late father, a man who had genuinely, quietly, and without complaint worked hard every single day of his life until his body finally gave out. A man who had never once stolen from his family. "What is this?" I asked, my voice dropping an involuntary octave. "Why are my personal belongings sitting in a garbage bag?" Barbara sighed loudly and heavily, performing the exasperated patience of a woman dealing with a toddler throwing a prolonged tantrum over something trivial. "I am decluttering," she said simply, as though the word itself were a complete and sufficient explanation. "Your taste is incredibly drab, Olivia. Those cheap little picture frames and your woven baskets simply do not project wealth or sophistication." Richard Harrison is a man of extremely high standards and refined sensibilities. When he walks into this house on Friday evening, he needs to be greeted by a clean, modern, aspirational canvas, not a shrine to your middle-class upbringing. She paused, apparently pleased with her own assessment. "I removed all the clutter so we can bring in high-end staging furniture tomorrow morning. The space needs to breathe." She had thrown away my family photographs. She had casually discarded intimate, irreplaceable pieces of my personal history to create a counterfeit billionaire aesthetic designed to benefit her unemployed son. A surge of pure, incandescent rage spiked behind my eyes with such force that my vision briefly blurred at the edges. I wanted to grab her firmly by the shoulders and physically escort her out through my front door. I wanted to stand in the center of my own living room and scream at full volume that she was standing inside a property that legally and exclusively belonged to me. I wanted to tell her, right then and right there, that her precious son was not a visionary. He was a felon in active construction. But Jamal's voice came back to me immediately, steady and precise. "Do not let them know you are on to the legal reality. Let them think they won." I carefully wiped the thin layer of dust from my father's picture frame and held it firmly against my chest. I forced my facial muscles, one by one, to release their tension and relax into something neutral. I swallowed the fire building in the back of my throat and looked at Barbara with the blankest, most defeated expression I could manufacture. "You are right," I said softly. Barbara blinked. She had clearly braced herself for a screaming confrontation, the kind that had happened before and always ended with her feeling righteously victimized. "Excuse me?" she asked, thrown entirely off her prepared script. "I said you are right," I repeated, carefully modulating my voice to sound as genuinely tired and quietly submissive as possible. "Derek needs this evening to be absolutely perfect. If staying here and redesigning the living room will meaningfully help him secure the investment, then the guest room is yours. Do whatever you need to do, Barbara." Her suspicious, narrowed glare melted slowly but visibly into a triumphant smirk. She genuinely believed, with complete conviction, that she had finally and thoroughly broken my spirit. She gave a short, satisfied nod and turned immediately back to measuring the walls for her rented furniture, already mentally placing pieces. I turned away from her and walked up the stairs, clutching the photograph of my father tightly against my chest with both arms. They were rearranging deck chairs on a ship that was already underwater, and I was holding the only life raft in existence. I simply needed to survive until my lunch meeting with Jamal the following day. At exactly noon the next day, I stepped through the heavy glass doors of my corporate building and walked 3.5 blocks through the midday foot traffic to a small, deliberately low-profile independent coffee shop tucked between a dry cleaner and an accountant's office. The lunchtime rush had not yet fully arrived, leaving the interior relatively quiet and easy to survey. I scanned the room from the doorway and immediately spotted Jamal sitting in a corner booth at the very back, positioned with his back to the wall and a clear sightline to the entrance, the way people who handle sensitive information instinctively sit. He wore a sharp charcoal suit with a dark tie, his posture characteristically rigid, his entire demeanor radiating the quiet, contained, and slightly intimidating confidence of a man who spent his professional life unraveling financial crimes that other people believed were perfectly concealed. Resting on the scratched wooden table directly in front of him was a thick red folder. I slid into the vinyl booth across from him without needing to be waved over. He had already ordered me a black coffee, knowing from years of shared family events that I would desperately need the caffeine after a sleepless night sharing a roof with my mother-in-law. "How is the home front?" Jamal asked, his dark, perceptive eyes reading my exhausted expression with professional efficiency. "Barbara moved in," I replied flatly, wrapping my cold hands around the warm ceramic mug. "She threw away my family photos to make room for rented staging furniture. She wants the house to look like a billionaire's bachelor pad for the pitch dinner on Friday. She informed me my taste was too middle class." I paused. "She also wants me to liquidate my 401k to buy a $10,000 Italian leather sofa by tomorrow afternoon." Jamal let out a low, rumbling sound that functioned as a laugh, but contained absolutely no genuine amusement. "The absolute, bottomless arrogance of that family will never stop being remarkable," he said, shaking his head slowly. He tapped his long fingers against the top of the red folder with a measured deliberateness. "It is actually deeply ironic, almost poetic really, that Barbara is redecorating your house and treating you like domestic staff, considering who actually and exclusively owns the property on paper." He slid the red folder smoothly across the table in my direction. I opened it carefully. Lying on top of a dense stack of financial logs and transaction printouts was a crisp, official document bearing the embossed blue seal of the county clerk's office. It was a quit-claim deed. I pulled the official property records from the county database first thing this morning, just to make absolutely certain everything was legally ironclad, Jamal explained, keeping his voice low and measured so the barista wiping down the counter nearby could not catch a single word. As a forensic accountant, I never rely solely on memory. I need documented paper trails for everything, and I needed to verify beyond any doubt that Derek had never quietly attempted to reverse the filing. But there it is, Olivia. 100% sole ownership, legally recorded, officially filed, and registered exclusively and entirely in your name. I stared down at the document, my eyes tracking slowly down to Derek's messy, slightly hurried signature at the bottom of the page. The memory of the exact day he had signed it came rushing back to me with sudden, vivid, almost painful clarity. It was exactly 14 months ago. Derek had come home pale, visibly sweating, and barely holding himself together, clutching in both hands a formal audit notice from the Internal Revenue Service. He had been running an unregistered cryptocurrency trading operation with several of his circle of unemployed friends and had completely, catastrophically failed to report any of his capital gains or losses to the federal government. Terrified that federal agents were going to place a tax lien directly on our home and seize his personal assets to cover the mounting penalties and fees, he had begged me, literally, standing in our kitchen with tears tracking down his face, to allow him to transfer the deed of the house entirely into my name. He was crying when he signed this, I recalled, my finger resting lightly on the notary stamp. He had said signing the house over to me was the only available mechanism to protect our family from the consequences of his own catastrophic mistake. He had sworn up and down, repeatedly and emphatically, that he would secure a real job and permanently walk away from speculative cryptocurrency schemes once the audit resolved itself. And instead of getting a job, Jamal said, leaning forward and resting his forearms on the edge of the table, he drained his own children's education fund and committed bank fraud to buy a truck. He let the silence sit for exactly one beat. The genuinely remarkable thing about a narcissist like Derek is that they have extraordinarily short and selective memories when it comes to their own failures and the favors they have extracted from others. He signed that quit-claim deed purely to protect himself, viewing it as nothing more than a temporary legal workaround to outmaneuver the federal government. In his completely delusional internal landscape, he still thinks of that house as his personal castle, his domain, the headquarters of his imaginary empire. He has entirely forgotten that legally, at this precise moment, he is nothing more than an unlicensed tenant residing on your private property. I closed the red folder, the satisfying weight of the document making me feel, for the first time in 2 days, genuinely grounded and anchored in reality. So when Barbara announces she is moving in permanently to supervise me, I said slowly, a genuine dark smile finally crossing my lips for the first time since Tuesday night. She is effectively threatening the landlord. Exactly, Jamal said, his expression remaining completely and professionally serious. Every single time they disrespect you in that house, I want you to hold on to that knowledge. You hold every key. He paused. But you cannot play that card yet, Olivia. A quitclaim deed is an extraordinarily powerful legal shield, but it is not the sword we need to actually finish this. He held my gaze steadily. Let Barbara redecorate. Let Derek play the successful host and order you around his borrowed stage set. Let them both dig their respective graves a few feet deeper. Because what I uncovered in his bank records this morning is substantially, materially worse than stealing from a college savings account. A cold wave moved through my chest as Jamal spoke. Worse than stealing from our children? I asked, my voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Jamal, what else could he possibly have done? Jamal did not answer immediately. He reached deliberately back into the thick red folder and produced a second substantial stack of stapled papers. These pages bore the official corporate logo of a major national banking institution along their header. He placed the stack directly in front of me on the table, pressing his index finger firmly on the bold printed heading at the top of the first page. Read it, he instructed quietly. I leaned forward and scanned the document carefully. It was a home equity line of credit agreement, a HELOC. My eyes moved immediately to the principal amount listed on the second line, $100,000. The blood drained visibly from my face, leaving me briefly lightheaded. He took out a second mortgage on the house, I breathed, the words feeling thick and heavy on my tongue. He leveraged the equity I have been building and protecting for the last 10 years to borrow $100,000. Jamal nodded slowly, watching my face. He submitted the application 3 weeks ago. The bank approved it last Friday, and the full funds were deposited directly into his personal checking account yesterday morning, right before he drove across town to the dealership to purchase that truck. I shook my head, my mind working rapidly through the procedural impossibility of what I was reading. But that cannot be right, I said, looking up sharply at Jamal. We just confirmed that the house is legally, exclusively, and entirely mine. He signed the quitclaim deed over a year ago. No legitimate financial institution in this country would approve a home equity loan against a property without the explicit, legally binding written consent of the sole title holder. I never spoke to a single loan officer. I never received so much as a preliminary document in the mail. Turn to the last page, Jamal said, his voice carrying no inflection whatsoever. I flipped methodically through the dense pages of legal language and disclosures until I reached the signature section at the very end. There, printed neatly on the designated signature line, was my full name. Printed beside it, in blue ballpoint ink, was a signature that bore a striking, almost convincing resemblance to mine. The distinctive loop of the capital O, the sharp forward slant of the VI, they had been replicated with obvious effort and some practice. But as a finance manager who spent a significant portion of every working day reviewing executed contracts and authenticated signatures, I could identify the hesitation lines buried within the pen strokes immediately. The slight overcorrection at the terminal of each letter. The microscopic pause before each connecting stroke. It was a tracing job. Careful but ultimately detectable. He had likely used a personal check or a piece of official mail bearing my existing signature to copy the handwriting underneath a light source. He forged my signature, I said, staring at the blue ink. My own husband forged my signature on federal banking documents. He did, Jamal confirmed without flinching. And it does not stop at the signature itself, Olivia. He did not simply forge your name and hope no one looked closely. He orchestrated a complete fraudulent filing. Look at the notary stamp positioned directly below your forged name. I shifted my gaze downward. There was a perfectly circular black ink stamp from a certified public notary, officially declaring that I had presented valid government-issued identification and personally signed the document in the notary's verified presence. The notary's printed name was one I had absolutely never encountered before in any context. I ran that notary commission number through the state registry the first thing this morning, Jamal explained, leaning back in the booth and crossing his arms deliberately. The commission number does not exist in any state database. It is entirely fabricated. The name attached to it belongs to one of those unemployed men who was standing on your patio drinking craft beer 2 nights ago. He paused to let that land. He purchased a counterfeit notary stamp through an online marketplace for approximately $20 and used it to make the paperwork appear legitimate to the bank's automated digital processing system. The entire application was submitted electronically, specifically structured to bypass the requirement of sitting in front of an actual licensed loan officer who might have asked difficult questions. I sat back slowly against the vinyl seat of the booth, the full, crushing architecture of Derek's betrayal pressing the air out of my lungs in stages. He had not made a reckless, impulsive financial mistake. He had planned this. He had premeditated and coordinated a multi-layered fraud involving multiple participants. He had stolen my legal identity, forged my official signature on federal banking documents, created falsified notarizations, and defrauded a major federally insured financial institution for $100,000. And he had executed every single step of it while eating the dinners I cooked for him, spending the income I earned working 16-hour days, and sleeping undisturbed in the bed I paid for. This is not simply a bad husband taking advantage of a hard-working wife, Jamal said, his tone shifting into something sharp and precise as a scalpel. This is felony bank fraud. This is aggravated identity theft under federal statute. This is conspiracy to commit wire fraud involving multiple co-conspirators. The federal government does not treat lightly the manipulation of a federally insured banking system using counterfeit notary instruments. He paused. Derek is not facing a contentious divorce hearing and a mediator. He is facing the realistic prospect of serious federal prison time. My hands began to tremble. Not from fear this time, but from the overwhelming, clarifying weight of the power I now held in my possession. The man who had shoved an empty bowl into my exhausted hands and ordered nachos at midnight. The man whose mother was currently dismantling my living room and throwing my family photographs in garbage bags. That man was a walking, breathing, extremely well-documented federal criminal who had left a digital paper trail stretching back weeks. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice hardening into something cold and entirely resolved. Jamal leaned forward, a fierce, controlled glint settling in his dark eyes. "We let him hang himself," he said. "Hang himself," I repeated, my voice rising a controlled fraction before I consciously caught and lowered it back down. "Jamal, I am not prepared to wait around passively while he hangs himself. He has already forged a legal document and placed a $100,000 lien against my house. I want to call the authorities right now." I reached into my purse, my fingers making immediate contact with the cool metal edge of my phone. The image was vivid and immediate in my mind. Squad cars pulling slowly onto my quiet suburban street. Officers walking up the front path. Derek being escorted out through his own front door in handcuffs before dinner. Jamal reached across the table with a single, firm, decisive motion and placed his large hand over mine, stopping me from pulling the phone from my bag. "Listen to me very carefully," he said, his voice dropping into a register of absolute and quiet authority. If you call local law enforcement right now, they will arrest him on a state-level forgery charge. He will retain a defense attorney within hours who will immediately frame this as a complicated marital dispute. Two spouses with joint financial entanglements and a messy disagreement over consent. They will argue that you gave verbal authorization for the loan and are now recanting out of spite during a deteriorating marriage. Best case scenario under those conditions, he receives probation, a fine, and a legal debt structure that somehow finds a way to follow you through the divorce proceedings. I stared at Jamal, my heart pressing against my ribs. Then what is the alternative? We wait, Jamal said simply. We wait until he moves the money. Right now, that $100,000 is sitting completely untouched in a domestic checking account. But I know Derek's patterns intimately from the tax audit last year. He does not hold cash. He is going to attempt to hide it somewhere he believes is beyond the reach of conventional oversight. He thinks of himself as a financial genius, which, ironically, makes him entirely predictable. And that means he is going to attempt to funnel those stolen funds into unregulated cryptocurrency. Jamal retrieved his tablet from the seat beside him and opened a secure, real-time financial tracking dashboard. He pointed to a pending transaction authorization that his forensic monitoring software had already flagged and captured. He has already initiated the account setup process with an offshore cryptocurrency exchange, Jamal explained, tapping the relevant entry on the screen. He is planning to purchase a substantial block of low-regulation digital coins. His reasoning is that once he converts the cash into cryptocurrency, it becomes effectively untraceable, and he can avoid any capital gains tax liability when his imaginary startup eventually generates returns. But the clearing process for a transaction of this specific dollar amount requires 3 full business days to complete. I looked at the pending transaction on the screen, feeling a nauseating but clarifying mixture of disgust and absolute strategic certainty. What happens when the transfer actually clears? When that money crosses state lines and makes contact with an international server, Jamal said, leaning back and folding his arms with finality. The entire legal classification of what he has done changes fundamentally. It stops being a domestic dispute between spouses. It elevates immediately and irrevocably to federal wire fraud, a Class C felony under federal law. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice are not interested in marital misunderstandings or he-said-she-said divorce narratives. They are interested in financial crimes involving federally insured banking institutions and interstate and international commerce. If we wait for this wire to clear, Derek is facing a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. Not probation, not a fine, not a suspended sentence, a federal prison term. The gravity of Jamal's words settled over the small corner table like a physical weight. Federal wire fraud. A federal prison sentence. The stakes had become extraordinary. But for the first time in this entire ordeal, they were tilted decisively and irreversibly in my direction. When does the wire transfer clear? I asked, my voice steady now, the strategy crystallizing rapidly and completely in my mind. Friday afternoon, Jamal confirmed. Right around the precise window of time during which you are supposed to be in your kitchen preparing a ridiculous 5-course gourmet meal for his invented investor. He met my eyes directly, which means that for the next 3 days, you need to return to that house and perform the exact role they expect from you. The submissive, cooperative, slightly defeated wife. You cannot give Derek or Barbara a single reason to feel uneasy, suspicious, or motivated to alter their plans in any way. You cannot give him one reason to panic and cancel that transfer. I sat with that for a moment, running through the inventory of what it would actually require. The mountain of luggage in my foyer. Barbara reorganizing my furniture and discarding my memories while drinking my wine. Derek parading through the house in his stolen money designer shirts, barking orders and accepting my labor as his personal entitlement. The idea of biting my tongue, keeping my expression neutral, and actively serving them for 72 more hours felt physically like swallowing broken glass, slow, deliberate, and sharp at every inch. But then I thought about the quit-claim deed resting safely inside Jamal's red folder. I thought about the federal arrest warrant that was accumulating legal mass and momentum with every single hour that passed. And I thought about Friday. I can do it, I told Jamal, my voice cold and absolute and completely certain. I will cook the Wagyu beef. I will let Barbara fill my living room with her rented furniture and call my taste provincial. I will smile and pour the wine and serve every course on time. I will give him exactly 3 days of complete and convincing obedience. Jamal gave a single, brief, deeply satisfied nod. I will monitor the wire transfer around the clock without interruption. The moment those funds cross state lines on Friday, I am walking every piece of this evidence directly to my contacts at the district attorney's office. We will have the federal warrants fully prepared and signed before the appetizers have even been plated. I stood up from the booth, leaving my untouched coffee sitting cooling on the table. The terrified, hollow-eyed woman who had white-knuckled her steering wheel on a dark Tuesday night no longer existed in any meaningful sense. I walked out of the coffee shop into the midday light and headed back toward my corporate building, armed with the most dangerous weapon available to any person in any situation. I had the documented truth. I had the paper trail. And I was entirely, completely, and calmly prepared to use both. I drove home that Wednesday evening with Jamal's precise instructions running on a steady loop in the back of my mind. Perfect, cooperative, submissive wife. 3 more days. When I pulled into the driveway, Derek was absent. Presumably out somewhere driving his fraudulently financed truck to nowhere in particular, performing success for an audience of 0. I unlocked the front door and stepped into a house that no longer felt remotely like my home, and increasingly resembled hostile occupied territory under new and illegitimate management. The living room was completely and thoroughly stripped bare. Barbara had made swift and enthusiastic good on every threat she had issued. The space looked cold, emptied, and deliberately impersonal, like a showroom waiting for its staged pieces. She was positioned at the kitchen island, nursing a glass of wine and aggressively swiping through something on an expensive tablet with the focused energy of a woman managing a major corporate renovation. When she heard the distinctive click of my work heels against the hardwood floor, she did not bother to look up. She simply tapped the screen twice and slid the tablet deliberately across the granite countertop in my direction. "Look at this," Barbara commanded, her eyes still not rising to meet mine. I spent the entire day negotiating with incompetent staging companies. Their rental inventory looks cheap, mass-produced, and entirely lacking the executive presence that Richard Harrison will reasonably expect to encounter. I found a dramatically better solution. I looked down at the screen. It displayed a luxury interior design retailer's website, featuring a large, architectural, imported Italian leather sectional sofa. Below the photograph was a price listed in clean, unambiguous digits: $10,000. "I need you to order this immediately," Barbara said, finally picking up her wine glass and taking a slow, deliberate sip. "Include the expedited overnight freight shipping so delivery and assembly can be completed by tomorrow afternoon. It will establish exactly the correct visual and atmospheric tone for Friday's dinner." I stared at the price tag, feeling the familiar knot of disciplined frustration tighten carefully in my stomach. I raised my eyes to my mother-in-law's face. "Barbara," I said, keeping my tone intentionally soft and measured and gently defeated, "I genuinely cannot purchase a $10,000 sofa. Derek emptied our joint accounts yesterday morning. I barely have sufficient available credit on my remaining personal cards to cover the Wagyu beef and the truffle oil for the dinner itself. Barbara rolled her eyes with theatrical impatience and set her wineglass down on the granite with a sharp, deliberate click. Do not perform poverty for me, Olivia. You have a 401k retirement account through that medical supply company you work for. I am fully aware that you do. Cash it out. The sheer architectural audacity of her demand produced an involuntary sound from somewhere in my chest. A short, breathless, entirely genuine laugh of disbelief that I barely managed to contain. Liquidate my retirement account? I asked, making sure the specific clinical reality of her request was audible in every syllable. Barbara, withdrawing from a 401k before retirement age, incurs substantial mandatory federal tax penalties and an additional early withdrawal fee. The processing and clearing period alone takes multiple business days. And it would permanently eliminate the only independent financial security I have built outside of this marriage. I am not dismantling my retirement savings to purchase a leather sofa for a dinner party. Barbara stood up abruptly from her bar stool, her face flushing with the rapid, particular anger of someone unaccustomed to hearing the word "no" spoken calmly and without apology. She hated being refused, especially by the woman she had spent years viewing as nothing more than a useful obstacle standing between her son and his inevitable greatness. Your retirement, she repeated, her voice climbing sharply. You are so incredibly, breathtakingly selfish. When Derek secures this funding and his company launches, he will be a multimillionaire within 18 months. You will not require a modest corporate pension. But he cannot secure that funding if potential investors walk into a house that looks like a mid-range extended stay hotel. You are actively and deliberately sabotaging your own husband's potential. Her voice had reached a register that was becoming difficult to ignore in a quiet kitchen. I shook my head with measured, visible resistance, showing just enough friction to make my eventual partial capitulation feel earned and believable. If I agreed to every demand with immediate cheerfulness, Derek and Barbara would almost certainly register something was off. I will cook the 5-course meal, I told her firmly. I will manage the service and the wine, but I am not touching my retirement account. That is my final answer on that subject. I reached into my bag, retrieved my corporate laptop, and set it deliberately on the kitchen island. I lifted the screen and began entering my password with the practiced ease of someone settling in for a long evening of catch-up work, performing the quiet retreat of a woman choosing her spreadsheets over confrontation. I wanted to signal the end of the discussion and withdraw into the comfortable invisibility of professional busyness. Barbara stood in the kitchen for a sustained and heavy silence, her breathing audible through her nose. Then she moved. She walked with careful purpose toward the coffee maker positioned just a few feet from my open laptop. She picked up the large glass carafe, still half full of scalding black coffee that had been sitting in the machine since that afternoon. She turned around, took exactly 2 measured steps in my direction, and then deliberately, theatrically stumbled forward. With a sharp, performed gasp of fabricated surprise, she tilted the carafe forward with both hands. A wide, steaming cascade of dark coffee poured directly and completely over the keyboard of my work laptop. I pushed back from the counter immediately, the hot liquid splashing across the granite surface and narrowly missing my hands. The laptop screen flickered violently for a fraction of a second before producing a sharp, final electronic hiss. A thin wisp of gray smoke curled up from between the keys. The screen went entirely, permanently black. The motherboard had been destroyed instantly on contact. Oops, Barbara said, standing upright again and holding the empty glass carafe at her side. Her voice contained not the slightest trace of genuine surprise or regret. She stood there looking at the ruined machine with a wicked, quiet satisfaction playing at the corners of her mouth. Clumsy me. But honestly, Olivia, Perhaps you should not leave your little accounting equipment out on the counter when adults are attempting to coordinate serious business matters in the same space. I stood completely still and stared at the destroyed piece of hardware sitting in a spreading puddle of dark coffee. Any person in any reasonable circumstance would have screamed. I could have easily, justifiably picked up the remainder of my own coffee and returned the gesture with interest. But the red folder flashed immediately and vividly in my mind. The quitclaim deed, the forged notary stamp, the pending wire transfer, federal wire fraud. I took one slow, very deep breath and buried the rage. All of it. The entire accumulated, stacked weight of 3 days of it. Somewhere deep and cold and inaccessible. My corporate IT department would have a replacement laptop on my desk by 9 o'clock the following morning at no cost to me, under the standard equipment replacement policy. Barbara did not know that. She believed she had just destroyed my professional livelihood and primary work tool. She thought she had scored a devastating, decisive blow. I did not correct her understanding. I did not yell. I did not cry or argue or demand accountability. I simply reached for the roll of paper towels on the counter, gave Barbara one cold, completely empty smile that communicated nothing whatsoever, and began methodically wiping the spilled coffee from the granite surface. The clock was ticking steadily. Friday was approaching with the quiet, absolute certainty of a verdict that had already been written. I threw the soaked paper towels into the trash and spent the remainder of Wednesday evening performing contentment, preparing a simple dinner, loading the dishwasher, folding a load of laundry, making small talk when required. Entirely, convincingly fine. Every ordinary domestic gesture a carefully maintained performance. Every calm exchange a brick in the wall they would never see coming down. Thursday arrived wrapped in a suffocating, low-pressure tension that settled over the house like weather. It was the day before the pitch dinner, and the entire atmosphere carried the particular weight of something building toward a point of no return. After collecting my replacement laptop from the corporate IT department first thing that morning, exactly as I had predicted, no questions asked, no cost incurred. I left work early to begin the extensive prep work for the 5-course menu Derek had demanded, with the casual authority of a man who had never once cooked a meal in his adult life. I was standing at the kitchen island marinating the obscenely overpriced Wagyu beef I had been forced to charge to my nearly maxed-out personal credit card when I heard it. The heavy, aggressive roar of Derek's truck pulling into the driveway with the self-important engine note of a vehicle purchased to be heard. The front door clicked open. Derek did not walk into the kitchen alone. Trailing closely behind him was a woman I recognized with immediate visceral clarity. Her name was Kelsey. She had been Derek's girlfriend throughout his mid-20s, a relationship he had always referenced with a nostalgic, slightly wistful quality that I had been foolish enough to dismiss as irrelevant. She currently branded herself as a local lifestyle and wellness influencer across multiple social media platforms, her content a carefully curated blend of morning smoothie routines, crystals, and motivational captions about abundance. She walked into my house wearing an aggressively fitted workout set in a shade of coral that cost more than my first paycheck, carrying an oversized designer tote bag against one hip. The cloud of her overpowering floral perfume reached me before she did, instantly and completely overwhelming the warm, carefully layered scent of the garlic and fresh herbs I had been chopping for the past hour. Derek puffed out his chest and made his announcement with the proud, proprietorial energy of a man unveiling a solution to a problem no one had asked him to solve. He had brought in an expert, he declared. He had just retained Kelsey as his official brand consultant for the pitch dinner the following evening. He explained, with complete seriousness, that Richard Harrison was the kind of investor who evaluated the founder as a holistic package just as much as he evaluated the product itself, which meant Derek's personal aesthetic, his physical presence, and his projected energy all needed to be absolutely, immaculately flawless. He mentioned, as a throwaway detail, that he had paid Kelsey a $5,000 retainer fee to curate his wardrobe selections and systematically optimize his public speaking body language before tomorrow night. $5,000. He had taken more money from the fraudulent home equity loan, money secured by my forged signature on a property he did not own, and used it to hire his ex-girlfriend to advise him on how to stand in a room and which shirts to button. The sheer audacious brazenness of it sent a hot pulse of adrenaline straight through my bloodstream. I kept my face entirely neutral. I casually wiped my hands on the kitchen towel folded over my shoulder, reached unhurriedly into my blazer pocket, and pulled out my phone. Using the completely natural cover of checking a recipe measurement online, I opened the voice memo application with 2 quick taps, pressed the red record button, and placed the phone face down on the granite island directly beside the cutting board, close enough to capture every word spoken in the kitchen without attracting a single glance. Kelsey, for her part, did not acknowledge my existence in any way that might be confused for basic human courtesy. She leaned against the kitchen counter with practiced, performative ease, her bare arm deliberately and slowly brushing against Derek's as she positioned herself. She looked me up and down with the slow, analytical sweep of someone appraising a piece of furniture they were considering replacing. She let out a soft, precisely calibrated sigh. She told Derek it was genuinely fortunate that he had brought her in, because the overall energy signature of the house was entirely too corporate, too rigid, and too fundamentally cheerless to attract serious investment capital. She aimed a perfectly manicured fingernail directly at my sensible navy blue work trousers and clean white blouse, the clothes of a professional woman who had been at her desk since 7:30 that morning. Kelsey laughed, a light, dismissive sound, and told me I looked like a tired bank teller. She then advised me, with the generous magnanimity of someone bestowing helpful guidance, to make myself completely invisible during tomorrow night's pitch dinner, because my exhausted working-class energy would create a jarring and damaging aesthetic contradiction with the high-value environment Derek was carefully constructing for the investor. She actually suggested, with a straight face, that I confine myself to the pantry while Richard Harrison was present in the dining room, as though I were a piece of furniture that did not coordinate with the new rental pieces. Derek did not defend me. He did not hesitate, look uncomfortable, or introduce even a performative qualifier. He nodded in full, enthusiastic agreement, telling Kelsey she had a genuinely exceptional eye for environmental detail and confirming that he had already communicated to me that my role for the evening was that of a silent, invisible caterer. Kelsey then stepped several inches closer to Derek and reached up with both hands to adjust the collar of his shirt in a gesture so intimate and proprietary that it required no further interpretation. She practically purred as she told him he was absolutely destined for extraordinary things, and that it was nothing short of a tragedy that he had spent so many of his most productive years being systematically held back by people who simply lacked the intellectual and spiritual capacity to recognize the daily discipline of an alpha entrepreneur. She was openly, brazenly flirting with my husband in my kitchen, while I stood 3 feet away preparing his food, and my phone was quietly, patiently capturing every single syllable of their performance in high-quality digital audio. Barbara appeared in the kitchen doorway at precisely that moment, drawn by the unfamiliar voice and the general atmosphere of celebration emanating from the room she had begun treating as her personal domain. Instead of registering any maternal concern about the fact that her son's ex-girlfriend was actively repositioning herself as a figure of intimate authority in his life, Barbara crossed the kitchen with open arms and greeted Kelsey with a warm, full-bodied hug, the kind reserved for people whose arrival had been long anticipated. Barbara told Kelsey, loudly enough for me to hear every syllable, that it was so profoundly refreshing to finally have a woman in the house who genuinely understood and appreciated high society standards and the requirements of serious social presentation. They stood together in my kitchen, a perfectly unified, completely self-reinforcing front of collective delusion, conversing with the comfortable ease of old allies, their backs partially angled in my direction, as though I were a structural feature of the room rather than its legal owner. I picked up my chef's knife and returned to chopping the garlic without a single change in my expression. I did not allow my eyes to narrow at Kelsey. I did not demand, as I was entirely within my rights to do, that she leave my property immediately and permanently. I maintained the exact same carefully calibrated deadpan submission that I had been performing for the past 2 days with the consistency of a method actor deep in character. I kept my voice conversational, even faintly helpful, as I asked Kelsey whether she would be joining us for the pitch dinner the following evening. Derek jumped in before she could answer, confirming with obvious pleasure that she would absolutely be in attendance. She would be seated directly beside him at the dining table, he explained, positioned to help guide the natural flow of conversation and to ensure that his personal brand identity remained the central and dominant focal point of the entire evening. I nodded slowly, using the flat edge of my knife to scrape the pile of minced garlic into a small ceramic bowl. I told them both that sounded like a genuinely sound strategy. Kelsey smirked, the particular smirk of someone who has just established territorial dominance in a contested space and encountered zero meaningful resistance. The smirk of someone who does not yet understand what kind of territory she has just walked into. Derek collected 2 bottles of sparkling water from the refrigerator and steered Kelsey toward the living room to review his presentation slides at length, with Barbara following close behind carrying a plate of crackers to fuel the creative session. The moment the kitchen door settled shut behind them, I picked up my phone, ended the recording, and immediately saved the complete audio file to the secure, encrypted cloud folder I shared exclusively with Jamal. The implications were significant and immediate. Derek was no longer simply stealing money through forged documents and fraudulent loans. He was now actively compensating his ex-girlfriend with stolen federal funds to participate directly in his fraudulent pitch scheme, making her a knowing and compensated party to the overall criminal enterprise. The trap was becoming significantly more crowded by the hour, but I had engineered it with more than enough room for every single person who had chosen to walk into it. Friday morning arrived under a heavy, insistent downpour of cold rain that drummed steadily against the windows and matched the suffocating atmosphere inside the house with uncanny precision. I had been forced to burn an entire vacation day from my corporate position, a day I could not afford to lose and could not get back, simply to spend 8 consecutive hours functioning as a personal chef for the man who was simultaneously, methodically, robbing me. By noon, the rented staging furniture had arrived on a large commercial truck, and 2 delivery workers spent an hour navigating it through my front door under Barbara's imperious direction. She strode through the stripped living room in her house slippers, pointing with the assured authority of a woman who had studied interior design by watching luxury real estate television, instructing the workers to position the overpriced velvet chairs and angular glass side tables in the exact spots where my own carefully chosen pieces had stood for years. When they finished, the room looked like the impersonal, aspirational lobby of a boutique hotel that had been designed by committee to appeal to no one in particular. It looked absolutely, unmistakably, nothing like a home where 2 toddlers had learned to walk, where family dinners had happened, where a real life had been constructed through years of quiet, unglamorous work. I spent the entire afternoon in the kitchen, moving through the 5-course preparation with methodical focus. I shucked 24 fresh oysters, working through each shell with practiced efficiency while keeping the meat perfectly intact. I built the saffron risotto from a careful, patient foundation, adding the warm stock in measured increments and stirring continuously to achieve the specific creamy consistency that Derek had circled on the menu printout he had left on the counter. I trimmed and carefully seasoned the Wagyu ribeyes, managing the temperature with the precision the cut demanded. Derek did not offer to assist with a single element of any of this. Instead, he treated my kitchen like a high-pressure restaurant line and treated me like a junior cook operating under constant threat of termination. He hovered at my shoulder with the restless, supervisory energy of someone who understood nothing about what they were observing. He lifted the oven door to check the internal temperature of components that did not require checking. He stood directly behind me while I arranged the truffle shavings on the appetizer plates, critiquing my placement with the authority of a man who had never once purchased a truffle in his life. He told me I was slicing the artisanal bread at an unacceptably thick angle. He held a wine glass up to the pendant light and complained with visible displeasure that he could detect water spots on the crystal that would offend a man of Richard Harrison's refined sensibilities. I simply nodded, set down whatever I was holding, retrieved the microfiber polishing cloth from the drawer, and repolished the glass to a flawless transparency without comment or resistance. I did not argue with a single criticism. I let him perform his fraudulent authority over my kitchen and my labor without offering him even the friction of a raised eyebrow. Because every time my phone gave a quiet double vibration against my hip through the pocket of my apron, it was a silent, encrypted update from Jamal. The offshore wire transfer of the stolen $100,000 was actively progressing through the automated clearinghouse system, advancing through each stage of the international processing sequence with the quiet, irreversible momentum of a verdict being read aloud. The federal crime was no longer approaching. It was inches away from being permanently, irrevocably locked into the legal record. At precisely 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Derek walked back into the kitchen wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that fit him with the sharp precision of something that had been professionally altered. His hair was slicked back with expensive product, and he moved in a cloud of cologne that I recognized immediately as a brand I had seen charged to my personal credit card statement 3 days earlier. He poured himself a glass of sparkling water from the refrigerator with the unhurried ease of a man entirely at peace with the world he had constructed, and leaned against the granite island to watch me whisk the vinaigrette for the salad course. From directly above my head, through the kitchen ceiling, I could hear the deliberate, heavy footsteps of Kelsey, who had arrived from wherever she had spent the night an hour earlier and installed herself in my master bathroom to complete her hair and makeup in front of my mirror, using my counter space and my lighting and my electricity. "Listen to me very carefully," Derek said, his voice descending into the particular register he reserved for instructions he believed were non-negotiable. "Richard Harrison is arriving at exactly 7. When the doorbell rings, you do not answer it. Barbara will greet him at the door and take his coat. I will introduce him to Kelsey, who is going to present herself as my co-founder this evening. We are going to be seated at the dining table and you are going to bring out each course at precisely 15-minute intervals. Do you understand the timing?" I stopped whisking. I set the small whisk carefully on the edge of the bowl and looked up at him. I wiped my hands on my apron with unhurried deliberateness. I asked him, with entirely genuine calm, whether I should set a 4th place at the far end of the table for myself. Derek scoffed with the volume and completeness of a man who found the question beneath him. He shook his head as though I had asked something genuinely, almost touchingly absurd. "Absolutely not," he said, and a short, hard laugh escaped him. "You are not sitting with us. This is a high-stakes investor meeting, Olivia Suh, not a family dinner. We need to project the image of a dynamic, forward-thinking tech power couple with vision and momentum. Kelsey understands that dynamic instinctively. She knows the industry vocabulary. She knows when to laugh and how to make high net worth individuals feel seen and engaged. You are a bookkeeper. He said the last word the way people say just before something, a deliberate diminishment, a reduction. You would sit there looking exhausted and systematically kill the entire energy of the pitch before the appetizers were finished. He pointed one finger toward the swinging door between the kitchen and the formal dining room, his voice dropping into the cold, flat register of a command that expected no negotiation. "You will stay in this kitchen," he instructed. "When you bring the plates out, you pour the wine from the right. You clear the empty plates from the left. You do not speak unless directly addressed by a guest. For tonight?" He paused, as though the weight and the rightness of what he was about to say required a moment of preparation. "You are the help. Do you understand me? The help." I looked at my husband. I looked at him the way you look at something you have finally, completely, and irrevocably finished seeing. The man whose laundry I had folded for 5 years without complaint. The man whose children I had carried and delivered and raised through sleepless nights while he slept undisturbed. He was standing inside a house that legally belonged entirely and exclusively to me, wearing clothing funded with money I had earned, preparing to pitch a fraudulent company built on capital he had stolen from our sleeping children. And he was instructing me to remain silent in my own kitchen and serve him and his ex-girlfriend like domestic staff. I did not slap him. I did not lift the bowl of vinaigrette and pour it over his perfectly arranged hair. I did not remind him of a single fact about who owned the floor he was standing on. Instead, something extraordinary and utterly quiet moved through my body. A supreme, almost euphoric wave of absolute calm that started in my chest and spread outward to every extremity. The kind of calm that only arrives when you know with complete certainty that everything is already in motion and nothing can be reversed. I looked him directly in both eyes and gave him the softest, most cooperative, most genuinely untroubling smile I had ever produced. "I understand completely, Derek," I said, my voice smooth and entirely unwavering, as level and clear as still water over polished stone. "I will stay in the kitchen. I will serve the food on schedule. I will not make a single sound to disturb your evening." "Good," Derek said, adjusting his silk tie with 2 fingers and the satisfied expression of a man who has resolved a minor administrative matter. "Just do your job, and we will all be wealthy by tomorrow morning." He walked out of the kitchen with his shoulders back and his chin up, completely and catastrophically blind to the reality he was moving through. He believed he had successfully and permanently relegated me to the shadows, to an apron and a swinging door and a designated lane of silent service. He had no conception whatsoever that I was not hiding in the kitchen. I was sitting in the control room, and my finger had been resting lightly over the launch button for the past 72 hours. The kitchen door swung shut behind him with a soft, definitive thud that sealed me inside my designated workspace. I stood alone in the center of the room, entirely still, and listened to the muffled, overlapping sounds of laughter and clinking glasses drifting through the wall from the living room. Derek, Barbara, and Kelsey were celebrating their imaginary, imminent victory with the unguarded enthusiasm of people who genuinely believe they have outsmarted the situation. They sounded confident, not the careful, earned confidence of people who have done the work, but the loud, brittle confidence of people who have never once been held accountable for what they have taken. They sounded like people who had successfully broken the woman paying for everything and assumed she would stay broken. I turned back to the granite island and picked up my chef's knife, resuming the final preparation of the Wagyu ribeyes with hands that were perfectly, almost unnervingly, steady. I looked up at the digital clock on the face of the stainless steel oven. 5 p.m. exactly. Richard Harrison was scheduled to arrive in precisely 2 hours. The house was saturated with the rich, layered aroma of slow roasting garlic and searing premium beef, warm and complex, and completely at odds with the absolute toxicity of the people currently laughing in the adjacent room. I focused deliberately on the rhythmic grounding motion of my knife through the fresh herbs, using the repetitive physical task as a regulated valve for the adrenaline that was steadily, quietly building behind my sternum. Every passing minute felt stretched and elastic, but I understood instinctively that I could not rush any part of what was coming. Every element had to arrive exactly on schedule. Then the sharp, unmistakable double vibration against my hip cut through everything. I set the knife down immediately and without hesitation. I wiped both hands clean on a fresh side towel with 2 deliberate strokes and reached into the deep pocket of my apron. I pulled out my phone and unlocked the screen. The notification was a message from Jamal, delivered through our encrypted application. I tapped it open, my heart delivering one single hard, heavy beat against the inside of my ribs. The message was an image attachment followed by a single line of text. I opened the image first. It was a high-resolution screenshot taken directly from Jamal's forensic financial tracing software, the kind of specialized system used to track the movement of money across institutional boundaries in real time. The screen was dense with routing numbers, international bank identification codes, and precise digital timestamps recorded to the second. But right at the center of the image, surrounded by Jamal's software and highlighted in a vivid, unambiguous red, was the transaction I had been holding my breath waiting for since Tuesday night. Outgoing wire transfer, completed, principal amount, $100,000.00, originating account, Derek M., personal checking. Destination, offshore cryptocurrency exchange, registered jurisdiction, non-compliant with United States federal tax reporting requirements. I stared at the numbers on the screen and let the full, irreversible reality of the image settle through me in layers. The money was gone. Derek had actually done it. He had taken the fraudulent home equity loan secured by my forged signature on a property he did not own, converted the entire stolen principal into untraceable digital currency through an offshore exchange specifically chosen for its non-compliance with American financial law, and wired every cent of it across international borders. He had done exactly what Jamal had predicted he would do, with exactly the timing Jamal had predicted, following exactly the pattern of a man who believed his financial cleverness was invisible to everyone around him. I scrolled to the text message Jamal had placed directly below the screenshot image. The wire just cleared the automated clearinghouse. Funds have officially exited domestic jurisdiction. He used a digital network to execute the full transfer. The trap is officially and permanently closed, Olivia. The federal crime of felony wire fraud is now 100% complete and fully documented. There is no unwinding this transaction. There is no reversing, canceling, or restructuring what he has done. He just purchased himself a mandatory federal prison sentence. A long, shaky breath left my body, the kind that carries with it something that has been held under pressure for too long. I leaned back slowly and let my shoulders rest against the cool, smooth surface of the marble countertop behind me, and I closed my eyes for exactly one moment, one single, complete breath of stillness. For the past 3 days, I had existed in a sustained, exhausting state of controlled anxiety, quietly terrified that Derek might feel a flicker of uncharacteristic caution, that the bank's automated system might flag the transaction before it completed, that some random variable I had not anticipated might interrupt the sequence before it reached the point of no return. If the money had remained in his domestic checking account, even with all the forged documents, even with the fake notary stamp, even with every piece of evidence Jamal had compiled, a skilled defense attorney might have argued the transaction down to a lesser charge and constructed a narrative of marital dispute and disputed consent. But Derek had been too greedy, too impatient, and too fundamentally convinced of his own untouchability. His desperation to render the stolen money invisible had overridden every instinct for self-preservation he might have possessed. He had driven himself, with purpose and enthusiasm, directly off the edge of the cliff. My phone buzzed again immediately with a second message from Jamal. I am assembling the final comprehensive evidence package right now. Forged HELOC documents, fraudulent notary registration data, the $45,000 college fund withdrawal chain, Kelsey's $5,000 retainer payment from the stolen loan funds, and tonight's completed offshore wire confirmation. All of it is going directly to my contact at the district attorney's office and the Regional Federal Financial Crimes Task Force. They have been on standby since yesterday evening, waiting for this exact confirmation. I will be at your house before the dessert course is plated. Hold the line. I typed back a single word. Understood. I slipped the phone back into my apron pocket. The power dynamic inside the house had shifted so completely and so irreversibly in the past 3 minutes that it was almost physical. A pressure change, like the moment before a storm breaks. Even though the 3 people laughing in the living room had absolutely no awareness of it yet, the reality of their situation had already been permanently determined. Derek was no longer a husband overstepping his boundaries and taking advantage of a patient wife. He was a federal suspect enjoying the final hours of his freedom in a house he did not own. Barbara was no longer a domineering mother-in-law asserting her authority over an easy target. She was a woman about to watch her golden, brilliant, visionary son be methodically and completely dismantled by the weight of his own documented choices. And Kelsey, who had walked into my kitchen that afternoon and suggested I hide in my own pantry, was about to discover the precise and costly difference between being a brand consultant and being a knowing participant in a federal fraud scheme. I turned my full attention back to the stove. I adjusted the heat beneath the saffron risotto with 2 careful turns of the dial and resumed stirring the creamy, fragrant mixture with slow, measured, deliberate rotations of the wooden spoon. The trap was armed and locked. The evidence was secured, packaged, and in transit. All I needed to do now was plate the food, pour the wine with appropriate precision, and wait for the doorbell to ring at 7 o'clock. At exactly 6:55 in the evening, the sharp, melodic chime of the front doorbell cut cleanly through the house and through the low, self-consciously sophisticated jazz music Derek had programmed through the smart speakers in the living room. Music selected, I had no doubt, specifically to signal to Richard Harrison that he was entering the home of a man with curated taste. I was standing at the kitchen counter at that precise moment, carefully wiping the last traces of sauce from the curved edges of the chilled oyster appetizer plates with a folded kitchen towel, ensuring that every rim was flawless. The risotto was holding perfectly at temperature, the Wagyu was resting under its foil tent, and the trap was fully operational and waiting. Before I had even set the towel down completely, the swinging kitchen door burst open with urgent force. Barbara rushed into the kitchen with the barely contained feverish energy of someone who had been rehearsing this moment in her mind all week. Her face was flushed a deep, excited pink. She was wearing a heavily sequined dress in a shade of deep gold that was aggressively, thoroughly inappropriate for a residential business dinner in the suburbs on a rainy Friday evening. The kind of garment that communicated a profound misunderstanding of what kind of event she was attending. She pointed a sharp, freshly manicured finger directly at me. "The investor is here," Barbara hissed, her voice trembling at the edges with the particular quality of someone whose heart rate was elevated by proximity to imagined wealth. "Stop fussing over the plates and get yourself to the foyer immediately. You need to collect his coat and his umbrella. And keep your head down. Do not look him directly in the eye, and do not speak unless he addresses you with a specific question." She turned and swept back out before I could respond. I placed the polishing cloth on the counter with quiet finality. I smoothed both hands down the front of my plain black apron, pressing out the last invisible wrinkle. I offered Barbara's retreating back a brief, entirely cooperative nod, completely masking the adrenaline that was now moving through my bloodstream in steady, powerful waves. I followed her out of the kitchen and walked quietly down the hallway toward the front entrance, keeping my footsteps measured and unhurried. The heavy mahogany front door was already open wide. The cold, damp evening air pushed into the house, carrying with it the clean, sharp smell of heavy rain and wet asphalt and something else, the particular atmospheric electricity of a moment that has been building for days and has finally arrived. Derek was standing squarely in the center of the open doorway, practically vibrating from the inside out with poorly contained eagerness, holding a polished silver tray bearing 3 crystal champagne flutes filled with something expensive. Positioned directly beside him, her weight shifted onto one hip, her chin tilted at a practiced angle, was Kelsey, performing the body language of professional confidence with the visible effort of someone who had rehearsed it that afternoon in front of a mirror. Parked in the driveway, completely and neatly boxing in the fraudulently purchased truck from every angle, was a massive, gleaming black Lincoln Navigator town car. A driver in a dark suit stood on the wet pavement holding a large black umbrella steady over the man stepping out of the rear passenger door with the unhurried ease of someone who has never once been required to rush. Richard Harrison did not look even remotely like the manageable, accessible, slightly gullible target that Derek had apparently constructed in his imagination over the past several months of scheming. He was a tall, genuinely imposing man in his late 50s, carrying himself with the particular physical ease of someone who has spent decades in rooms where the decisions being made affected thousands of people. His silver hair was sharp and precisely cut. His navy pinstriped suit was tailored with the kind of attention to structure and proportion that announces itself to anyone paying attention. He moved across the wet driveway with the effortless, unhurried authority of someone who manages not just money, but the expectations and behaviors of the people who want it. He was not a man who could be charmed by ambient jazz and rented furniture. But what caused the blood to briefly drain from Derek's face, a fraction of a second of naked alarm quickly suppressed behind the recovery of his manufactured confidence, was the fact that Richard Harrison had not arrived alone. 2 younger men stepped out of the town car directly behind him, both wearing equally severe, well-fitted dark suits, each carrying a heavy leather briefcase with the practiced, slightly possessive grip of people who carry important things everywhere. They moved with the coordinated, purposeful efficiency of men who were not present for the food. Derek cleared his throat audibly, visibly recalibrated, and stepped forward with his recovered smile and his silver tray. "Richard, welcome to our home," Derek announced at a volume slightly too large for the moment, his arms sweeping in a gesture of broad hospitality. "We are absolutely thrilled and honored to have you here this evening. I see you've brought some associates along tonight." He held the tray of champagne forward with both hands. Richard stepped over the threshold with the measured, unhurried motion of a man who enters rooms on his own terms. His dark eyes moved immediately and with obvious professional habit across the living room, taking in the rented velvet furniture, the staged glass tables, the conspicuous absence of anything that suggested real, lived-in life, registering all of it in approximately 2 seconds without his expression changing in any discernible way. He did not reach for the champagne. "Good evening, Derek," Richard said. His voice was deep and entirely devoid of performative warmth, not unfriendly, simply economical. "Yes, I make it a consistent practice never to attend a pitch meeting for this level of investment without my lead risk analyst and my general counsel present. When we are discussing multi-million-dollar evaluations and potential equity structures, I prefer to have my legal team in the room to assess the structural integrity and verifiable accuracy of a founder's claims in real time." He paused just briefly enough for the sentence to land with its full weight. I trust that will not present any difficulty. Derek swallowed. His Adam's apple moved visibly above the expensive knot of his silk tie. Oh, of course. Absolutely none whatsoever, Derek managed, his voice carrying the particular strain of a man performing ease he does not feel. We operate with complete transparency here. That is a core value of our entire organization. He pivoted quickly, extending one arm toward Kelsey with the proud presentation of someone revealing a key asset. Speaking of the team, Richard, I want to introduce you to Kelsey. She is my co-founder and the primary visionary behind our brand identity and aesthetic architecture. Kelsey stepped forward with practiced energy, completely bypassing the two lawyers as though they were part of the furniture, and extended her hand to Richard with an enthusiasm calibrated to read as warmth. She launched immediately and without pause into a compressed, rehearsed version of her elevator pitch. Something about synergy frameworks and holistic user engagement philosophies and organic community growth modeling. Richard shook her hand with the brief, courteous efficiency of someone who shakes a great many hands professionally. His expression remained entirely, architecturally unreadable. The two lawyers standing behind him did not shake her hand. They simply regarded her with the flat, measuring patience of people who are paid to identify when information is being presented rather than communicated. Barbara, positioned just inside the hallway, snapped her fingers sharply in my direction. A deliberate public gesture designed to communicate hierarchy to the assembled guests and assert her organizational authority over the evening's proceedings. Olivia, Barbara commanded, her voice carrying the crisp projection of someone who wanted to be overheard. Collect their coats. I stepped forward from the shadow of the hallway, keeping my chin angled slightly downward, moving with the quiet, unobtrusive efficiency of someone whose entire purpose in the room is functional. I did not want Richard Harrison to focus on my face yet. I approached the group and extended both arms in the practiced gesture of someone accustomed to this particular task. Richard unbuttoned his heavy, rain-darkened cashmere overcoat with calm, unhurried fingers and handed it to me. He murmured a quiet, reflexive, "Thank you," barely glancing in my direction as his attention remained fixed on Derek, already beginning to process something about the room that he could not yet fully articulate. The two lawyers handed me their damp coats and folded umbrellas without comment, their eyes already moving around the dining room doorway with the preparatory focus of men mentally arranging their workspace. The weight of the wet wool across both my arms was substantial. But I felt, and this is the only accurate description, extraordinarily light. I turned away from the group and moved toward the hall closet with measured, unhurried steps, listening to Derek behind me enthusiastically steering Richard and the legal team toward the dining room with a flourish of promises about a revolutionary business proposal and an extraordinary culinary experience. Kelsey followed immediately at Derek's shoulder, laughing just slightly too loudly at a comment Richard had not actually made. I hung each coat on a separate wooden hanger with methodical care, secured both umbrellas in the brass stand beside the door, and smoothed my apron one final time with both palms. Derek walked into this evening believing he had arranged a casual, intimate conversation with a wealthy man who would be charmed by good food and confident buzzwords into handing over a check. He had no idea, not the faintest, most distant suspicion, that he had personally invited a corporate legal team into a house purchased with stolen funds to evaluate a company funded by a fraudulent bank loan secured with a forged signature, on a night when federal financial crimes investigators were already in motion. I turned on my heel and walked back into the kitchen. I arranged the chilled oysters on their bed of crushed ice with the focused attention of someone who understands that presentation is its own form of argument. Each shell was positioned at a precise angle, each garnished with a small cluster of fresh microgreens and a single drop of mignonette placed with the tip of a spoon. I lifted the heavy silver serving tray and balanced it carefully across my fingertips, then pushed the swinging kitchen door open just far enough to slide through without disturbing the room's atmosphere. The dining room felt immediately and unmistakably different from the kitchen. The air inside was denser, saturated with a tension that had nothing to do with the formal table setting or the soft overhead light from the chandelier. It was the specific tension of a room where the power dynamics have not yet been openly acknowledged, but are already fully understood by at least some of the people in it. Richard Harrison had taken the chair at the absolute head of the long glass dining table, not the seat Derek had presumably intended for him, but the chair that commanded the room, positioned with a clear and unobstructed sightline to every other person and every door. He sat with both hands resting flat on the glass surface, completely still, his posture communicating the quiet, settled authority of a man who does not need to perform confidence because he possesses it structurally. Flanking him on either side, with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this many times before, were his two lawyers. Their briefcases were already open. Thick legal pads and silver pens were positioned and ready. They were not here for the food. They had never been here for the food. At the opposite end of the table, Derek stood beside the large smart monitor he had connected to the wall display. He had switched the presentation to its title slide, a generic, aggressively blue neon logo hovering against a dark background. Seated aggressively close to Derek's standing position was Kelsey, her posture held at an artificial angle that she apparently believed projected corporate sophistication. Barbara occupied the chair directly across from Kelsey, her hands clasped beneath her chin, her face radiating a maternal pride so concentrated and unqualified it was almost difficult to look at directly. I moved through the room quietly, beginning with Richard, approaching from his right side to set the first plate exactly as I had been instructed. Richard did not look up from his study of Derek. I served the two lawyers in sequence, then Barbara, and finally Kelsey, who responded to the placement of her sparkling water with a barely audible, dismissive sound in the back of her throat that she apparently did not consider worth concealing. I retreated to my position beside the swinging kitchen door, holding the empty silver tray flat against the front of my apron, and became, to the room's primary occupants, entirely invisible. Derek cleared his throat with practiced authority, produced his most professionally constructed smile, and tapped his tablet. The smart monitor came to life. Derek began pacing, the carefully rehearsed back-and-forth movement of someone who has watched a significant number of TED Talks. "Gentlemen," he opened, his hands working through an elaborate series of gestures that communicated enthusiasm in the complete absence of specificity. "Welcome to the future of decentralized peer-to-peer engagement. We are living in a fast-paced, relentlessly evolving digital ecosystem, but current platforms universally fail to deliver holistic synergy to the modern user. My application, which I have named Connectify Web 3, is not simply a platform. It is a paradigm-shifting digital environment architected from the ground up to fundamentally disrupt the traditional social networking matrix at its core." I very nearly produced an audible sound. It was a word salad of such spectacular, towering ambition. Connectify Web 3, assembled from the spare parts of a dozen outdated startup blog posts, and delivered with the absolute conviction of someone who has never once been meaningfully questioned about its contents. As a finance manager who reviewed actual corporate business proposals and financial models every single working day of her professional life, I could identify with clinical precision that his entire presentation had been constructed by stringing together expensive-sounding terminology without a single coherent underlying financial structure to support any of it. Richard Harrison did not touch his oysters. He sat in complete stillness and watched Derek with the expression of a man cataloging information rather than receiving a pitch. Derek advanced to his next slide. A confusing, dense web of interconnected circular nodes and directional arrows that, upon extended examination, pointed in no consistent direction and arrived at no identifiable destination. We are utilizing a blockchain-enabled infrastructure to actively monetize user emotional bandwidth, Derek continued, his voice climbing in both volume and confidence as he moved further into familiar territory. By systematically leveraging proprietary artificial intelligence algorithms, we can accurately predict user synergy patterns and optimize localized networking outcomes at scale. One of the lawyers stopped writing. The cessation was so complete and so sudden that it functioned as its own form of punctuation. He looked up from his legal pad with the unhurried patience of someone who asks questions, not because he doesn't know the answer, but because the answer needs to exist on record. "How exactly do you plan to monetize emotional bandwidth?" he asked, his voice carrying the flat, neutral precision of someone reading from a list of necessary inquiries. "What is the actual, specific revenue generation model you are proposing? Are you operating on a subscription basis, or are you relying on advertising revenue driven by user data collection and behavioral targeting?" Derek froze. Not the brief, recoverable pause of someone selecting between several prepared answers, but the longer, more revealing stillness of someone who has just been asked a question that does not exist anywhere in their preparation. A bead of perspiration formed at his hairline, just above the carefully arranged part. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again and gestured with both hands in Kelsey's direction with the urgency of a man passing off a live grenade. "That is an absolutely excellent question regarding the granular financial architecture," Derek said, his voice carrying the particular strain of improvisation. "And I actually think my co-founder and brand strategist, Kelsey, is uniquely positioned to speak to the community valuation component of our model." Kelsey sat up straighter, adjusted her posture, and ran one hand through her hair with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being looked at. "Well," she began, her vocal delivery carrying the distinctive fry of someone whose primary communication platform is social media video. "It is really fundamentally about the vibe. You see, the modern digital user does not want to be monetized in the traditional sense. They want to be genuinely, organically empowered. Our brand identity is so intrinsically authentic and community-driven that the user base will naturally, spontaneously, want to invest their personal crypto holdings into our digital ecosystem. It is essentially a lifestyle movement that happens to exist in the form of an application." The second lawyer set his pen down on the legal pad with the quiet deliberateness of a man making a decision. A silence fell over the dining room that was so heavy and so complete that the sound of the rain against the windows became the only thing in it. Barbara, operating entirely without the capacity to read the room she was sitting in, broke the silence by clapping her hands together twice with genuine enthusiasm and turning to Richard with an expression of beaming, absolute maternal certainty. "Is it not simply brilliant?" she gushed, her voice carrying across the table with the force of a woman who has never doubted her own assessments. "My son has always possessed a visionary quality that most people simply lack the intellectual framework to recognize or appreciate. He genuinely sees things before the rest of the world catches up to him." Richard Harrison turned his head slowly and looked at Barbara with the measured, calibrated gaze of someone deciding how much of their attention a statement deserves. He held her eyes for exactly long enough to communicate a complete and unhurried assessment. Then he turned his gaze back to Derek, who was now perspiring visibly and continuously beneath the direct light of the dining room chandelier. "I stood quietly beside the kitchen door, holding the empty silver tray against my apron, and watched the slow, inevitable collapse of everything Derek had constructed. Every lie, every stolen dollar, every grandiose promise made at the expense of the people around him begin to make contact with unforgiving reality. Derek had stolen $100,000 from his own family, committed multiple counts of federal fraud, jeopardized the educational future of his 2 toddler children, and subjected me to 3 days of calculated humiliation and servitude, all to stand under an expensive chandelier in front of a billionaire and pitch a non-existent application called Connectify Web 3 to 2 lawyers who were paid specifically to identify exactly this kind of presentation. The humiliation contained in the moment was dense and almost architectural. And the genuinely extraordinary thing, the thing that made it almost difficult to stand still, was that the real show had not yet even started. Derek swallowed, gathered himself with visible effort, and advanced determinedly to his next slide. He began speaking louder and with more aggressive physical presence, pointing at a line graph that rose in a perfectly unbroken diagonal toward the upper right corner of the screen with the mathematical plausibility of a fairy tale. He declared that within 6 months of launch, Connectify Web 3 would achieve critical mass user adoption of a sufficient scale to render traditional social media infrastructure effectively obsolete. He deployed terms like algorithmic scaling and first-mover disruptive innovation and network effect compounding in rapid, overlapping succession, apparently operating under the belief that velocity of delivery could substitute for coherence of content. He was throwing language at the room with both hands and completely failing to notice that neither Richard Harrison nor either of his lawyers had looked at the presentation screen in over 90 seconds. Richard had placed both hands flat on the glass table surface. He leaned back slightly in the rented velvet chair. Just a few degrees, the precise and controlled movement of a man making a decision. And then, very slowly and deliberately, he turned his head. He was not looking at the monitor. He was not looking at Derek's graph, or Derek's gestures, or Derek's expensive tie. He was looking directly across the length of the dining room, past Derek's sweating face, and past the smart monitor and past the staged furniture and the rented ambient atmosphere, looking straight at the swinging kitchen door. Looking, with complete and unambiguous directness, straight at me. Derek caught the direction of Richard's gaze and misread it with the confidence of a man whose misreadings have never cost him anything, until now. He interpreted Richard's attention moving away from the presentation as a sign that he was losing momentum and needed to recapture it. He stepped quickly and deliberately into Richard's sightline, positioning himself between Richard and the kitchen door, and clapped his hands together once, a sharp, loud, room-commanding sound that he had clearly also rehearsed. He announced that if Richard was prepared to sign the term sheet tonight, they could lock in the founder's valuation and the equity structure before the broader market became aware of the opportunity. He promised it was the kind of timing that created generational wealth. Richard did not blink. He did not shift his gaze back to Derek. He raised his right hand with a single, unhurried motion and extended one index finger, a gesture so quiet and so completely self-assured that it functioned like a physical change in the atmosphere of the room. Derek's mouth closed on its own. The room dropped into a dead, absolute silence, broken only by the steady percussion of heavy rain against the dining room windows. Richard pushed his chair back from the table. The legs made a long, slow scraping sound against the hardwood floor that carried to every corner of the room. He rose to his full height with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who is never in a hurry because he does not need to be, and took a moment to button the center button of his navy pinstriped suit jacket with 2 measured fingers. Derek mirrored his movement immediately and instinctively, straightening to his own full height, adjusting his posture, fixing his expression into something between authority and desperate hope. He extended his right hand fully across the glass table, palm open and ready, operating under the apparent belief that Richard Harrison had heard sufficient information and was rising to his feet to seal a multi-million-dollar investment deal with a handshake in the dining room of a house decorated with rented furniture on a rainy Friday evening in the suburbs. Richard did not reach for Derek's hand. He did not look at it. He did not look at Derek at all. He walked, calmly, directly, without hesitation, straight past my husband, stepping cleanly around the large display monitor without breaking stride, crossing the length of the dining room with a purpose that was entirely clear to every person watching, and walked directly toward the swinging kitchen door. Toward me. Barbara, still seated, held her breath entirely. Her face had taken on the particular quality of someone watching a sequence of events that refuses to arrange itself into any familiar pattern, her wide eyes tracking Richard's movement with an expression caught exactly between confusion and the first distant stirring of dread. Kelsey nervously checked her own reflection in the curved surface of her water goblet, turning it slightly as though the glass might offer her some reassurance. Entirely, visibly unsure of what was happening in the room and why the center of gravity had shifted so completely and so suddenly away from their side of the table. Derek stood frozen in place with his right hand still extended awkwardly into empty air, his fingers slightly spread, watching the billionaire walk past him as though he were a piece of staging furniture that had been positioned incorrectly. I did not move. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my expression completely composed, holding the silver serving tray flat against the front of my plain black apron, and I watched Richard Harrison close the last few feet of distance between us with the unhurried, deliberate stride of a man who goes precisely where he intends to go. When he was approximately 2 feet away from me, something extraordinary happened. The cold, analytical hardness that had occupied his dark eyes since the moment he stepped through the front door. The professional, evaluative flatness of someone conducting a risk assessment dissolved completely. It was replaced in an instant by something entirely different, genuine, immediate, and unmistakably warm recognition. Richard extended his right hand toward me without hesitation, and his voice carried easily across the silent dining room, resonating over the sound of the steady rain against the windows with the natural authority of someone accustomed to being heard in large rooms. "Olivia," Richard said, and a bright, authentic smile broke across his face, the unrehearsed kind that arrives before the person has decided to produce it. "I had absolutely no idea you lived here." I shifted the silver tray smoothly to my left arm and reached forward, shaking the hand of the billionaire angel investor with a firm, unhurried grip. "It is good to see you again, Richard," I replied, my voice entirely steady and completely professional. Richard let out a full, hearty laugh, the genuine kind, surprised out of him, and shook his head slowly, as though the coincidence required a moment to fully absorb. "Please, call me Richard. We settled that months ago," he insisted warmly. "I was literally just discussing your work with my legal team in the car on the drive over here tonight." He released my hand and straightened slightly, the warmth in his expression sharpening into something closer to professional admiration. "I have to tell you directly, the quarterly financial merger report your team submitted to the executive board this morning was absolutely brilliant work. Your structural analysis of the supply chain integration protocols alone saved our acquisition at least $2 million in projected quarterly losses. It was a genuine masterclass in applied corporate finance." The words settled into the dining room air like a detonated charge, expanding outward slowly, reaching every corner, finding every person seated at the table and pressing into them with different but equally devastating force. A masterclass in corporate finance. The billionaire angel investor had just stood in the center of my dining room and openly, publicly praised the high-level financial brilliance of the woman he had found, standing at the kitchen door in a serving apron. I glanced past Richard's shoulder. The expression on Derek's face was something I will carry with me and take out quietly on difficult days for the rest of my life. His jaw had come uncoupled from its normal relationship with the rest of his face. He was looking back and forth between Richard and me with the rapid, frantic eye movement of a person whose brain has received data it cannot process and is cycling desperately through alternative explanations that refuse to materialize. He had spent the last 3 days telling every person who would listen that I was a small-minded bookkeeper whose exhausted working-class energy would damage his professional image. He had banished me to the kitchen because my presence at the table would kill the vibe of his pitch. He had stood in front of me that very afternoon and told me I was the help with the conviction of a man who had never been wrong about anything important. Barbara had both hands clamped around the edge of the glass dining table, her knuckles completely white, her mouth opening and closing with the persistent, effortful silence of someone attempting speech while in a state of neurological shock. She had thrown my family photographs into a garbage bag 2 days ago because she had decided my aesthetic was insufficiently impressive for the man who was now standing in her son's dining room, treating me as a professional equal and intellectual peer. She had driven 45 minutes to move herself into my guest room permanently so she could supervise the preparation of an event designed to impress this exact man. And this exact man had just told the room that he had been talking about me admiringly in his town car on the way over. "Thank you, Richard," I said, maintaining my composed and entirely professional smile. My regional finance team invested a significant amount of careful work into ensuring the data was completely ironclad before the acquisition finalized. I will pass your feedback along to them. They will appreciate hearing it. Wait. Derek's voice came out cracked and broken, a sound produced by a throat that had stopped cooperating. He took one lurching step forward, his face the particular color of wet concrete. Gray-white and slightly porous-looking. "Richard, how exactly do you know my wife?" Richard turned around with the slow, unhurried deliberateness of a man who has decided exactly how he wants to handle the next several minutes. The moment he completed the turn and his eyes landed on Derek, the warmth evaporated from his face as cleanly and completely as morning mist. What replaced it was the cold, predatory assessment he had been wearing when he first arrived, except now it was concentrated, specific, and aimed at a single target. He looked at Derek the way you look at something you have just identified as a problem requiring resolution. Richard did not answer immediately. He took one slow, deliberate step away from me and moved back toward the center of the dining room, positioning himself with the instinctive spatial awareness of someone ensuring that every person in the room was fully oriented toward what he was about to say. The lawyers behind him adjusted their positions slightly, their legal pads already open. "How do I know your wife?" Richard repeated, his voice loading the words with a heavy, precise sarcasm that gave each syllable its full weight. "Derek, you invited me into this house tonight under the specific pretense that you were a detail-oriented, research-driven founder with a serious proposal. You claim to be a visionary. You use words like meticulous and strategic and data-informed to describe your professional methodology. And yet, you somehow managed to fail to perform the most elementary, most basic background research on the primary person you were desperately attempting to pitch." He paused to let the room hold that. "I am the chief executive officer and majority shareholder of the international medical conglomerate that recently completed the acquisition of the supply company where Olivia works. She is not a low-level employee. She is not a bookkeeper. She is not a woman who does data entry in a small cubicle." He said each of those last phrases with the particular weight of someone repeating words back to their source. She is the regional finance manager who personally oversees the entire Eastern Seaboard operations for my corporation, one of the most strategically critical roles in our post-acquisition organizational structure. Derek took a physical, involuntary step backward. His hip connected hard with the edge of the large presentation monitor behind him. The screen wobbled on its stand, swaying dramatically, an accidental but perfect reflection of the man in front of it. He looked between Richard and me with the wild, manic terror of someone watching the floor beneath them develop cracks in real time. Regional Finance Manager, Derek choked out, the phrase landing in his mouth as though it were written in a language he did not speak. No, that is, you must be confusing her with someone else. She does basic corporate accounting. She manages a small team. She works in a mid-level department. She does not. Richard let out a short, sharp bark of laughter. An involuntary sound, surprised out of him by the sheer, almost impressive magnitude of Derek's ignorance. It echoed off the rented staging furniture with an unflattering clarity. Bookkeeping, Richard said. Data entry. He shook his head with the slow movement of a man processing something between profound pity and genuine disgust. Is that honestly, sincerely, what you think she does? He straightened and looked at Derek with an expression that had settled into something harder and more permanent. Derek, your wife authorized the movement of over $40 million in corporate assets this morning alone. She sits in on executive board meetings that the vast majority of professionals in this industry could not buy their way into. She manages a financial portfolio that exceeds the gross domestic product of multiple sovereign nations. The fact that you have been living under the same roof as this woman, eating the food she prepared for you, spending the money she earned through 16-hour workdays, ordering her to stay in the kitchen so she wouldn't embarrass you in front of investors, and have genuinely, completely no idea who she is or what she is professionally capable of is, frankly, one of the most staggering things I have encountered in 30 years of evaluating founders. Barbara let out a strange, compressed, high-pitched sound, something between a wheeze and a gasp, and slumped backward into her velvet chair with the sudden heaviness of a woman whose structural support has been removed. Her hands were shaking visibly. She gripped the edge of the glass table with both of them to prevent herself from sliding further, and she stared at me with an expression I had genuinely never seen on her face before in 5 years. Complete and total absence of certainty. The woman she had directed to carry luggage, order leather furniture, cook gourmet meals on demand, and sleep in shame had been, this entire time, a high-powered corporate executive whose professional relationship with this room's most powerful occupant predated everything else happening at this table. Barbara had mistaken the landlord for the help, in every possible sense of both words. Kelsey had gone the color of uncooked pastry. Every carefully constructed layer of influencer bravado, the posture, the practiced smirk, the performative ease, had evaporated from her face with the totality of a stage set being struck after a show. She looked suddenly, painfully aware of how she had introduced herself, what she had said in my kitchen the day before, and precisely how small and how ridiculous the gap between her self-assessment and her actual standing in this room truly was. She looked very young. She looked like someone who had just understood the precise nature of the situation she had walked into. But Richard was not finished. He turned his attention to his 2 lawyers, who had remained standing with the patient stillness of men who had watched this kind of unraveling before, and understood the importance of letting it complete itself. Do you honestly think I drove all the way out to a suburban neighborhood on a rainy Friday evening to sit through a presentation from an unemployed man who uses phrases like holistic synergy and emotional bandwidth? Richard asked, his voice dropping into a low, graveled register that had an almost physical presence in the quiet room. I fund viable, functional technology, Derek. I fund founders with demonstrable work, verifiable prototypes, and coherent financial architecture. I do not fund presentations assembled from the discarded terminology of outdated startup blog posts. He paused, and the pause had weight. I receive hundreds of pitch decks every single week from actual innovators with actual products. Yours was so fundamentally disorganized, so technically illiterate, and so financially incoherent that my automated screening software very nearly routed it directly to the spam folder without human review. Derek's voice came out in something that was not quite a question, and not quite a statement, and not quite a sound a person makes on purpose. Then why? If you hated the pitch, why did you agree to come? Why did you bring your legal team all the way out here? Why didn't you just ignore it? Richard leaned forward and rested both fists, knuckles down, on the surface of the glass dining table. The gesture of a man making a point he wants the table to remember. Because before I discard a proposal entirely, it goes to my regional finance teams for a final risk assessment, standard protocol. He let the sentence rest for exactly one beat. Your pitch deck landed on a desk in Olivia's department. Her team flagged it immediately, not as a poorly constructed investment opportunity. Another beat, as a potential scam. Derek opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He looked like a man who had stepped confidently off what he believed was a solid surface and discovered mid-stride that there was nothing beneath him. When my analysts conducted a thorough background investigation into your professional history, Richard continued, his voice carrying the cold, relentless momentum of something that has been building for a long time and has finally arrived at its destination. They found zero evidence of a working prototype. They found no verifiable user base. They found no proprietary code, no registered intellectual property, and no legally constituted corporate entity. What they did find was a man with a documented history of federal tax evasion who had previously operated an unregistered cryptocurrency trading scheme while reporting zero taxable income. They classified your proposal as a high-risk, fraudulent endeavor, specifically designed to separate credulous investors from their capital. He straightened. I accepted this dinner invitation for one reason only, to allow my legal team to conduct a first-hand evaluation of whether your business practices violated any of our corporate fraud parameters before I referred you to the appropriate authorities. I had absolutely no idea, until I walked through that front door tonight, that the fraud I was investigating was being operated out of the home of my best regional finance manager. The dining room had achieved a silence so complete that the rain against the windows was the only sound in it, a steady, indifferent percussion that had no interest in what was happening inside. Derek's grand illusion was not cracked or dented or weakened. It was atomized. He was standing in the ruins of a persona he had constructed and maintained at the cost of everyone around him for years, stripped bare, exposed not merely as a failure, but as a deliberate, calculating fraud artist who had, through a combination of overconfidence and spectacular negligence, pitched his criminal scheme to his own wife's boss and invited that boss's legal team to sit down and document it over dinner. He had gilded the invitation with champagne and Wagyu beef. He had invited the executioner into his home and offered him a crystal flute. Richard straightened his suit jacket, adjusted one cuff with a precise, efficient movement, and looked across the room at me. He gave a small, deliberate, respectful nod, the nod of one professional acknowledging another, handing off the floor with the quiet confidence of someone who knows it is in capable hands. I set the silver serving tray on the nearest side table. I did not need it anymore. I was entirely, permanently done serving. I took one slow, deliberate step away from the kitchen door, and then another, and walked toward the head of the dining table with the unhurried, purposeful stride of someone who has been waiting 3 days for this exact moment, and has no intention of rushing it now that it has finally arrived. As I moved, I reached behind my back and found the ties of the plain black apron, pulling the knot loose with two steady fingers. I lifted the fabric over my head and let it fall from my hands without looking at where it landed. It dropped onto the hardwood floor in a loose, crumpled heap. A physical, visible shedding of every degrading role they had assigned me, every instruction to be invisible, every command to stay in the kitchen and not make a sound. 3 days of performed submission, discarded on the floor in a single gesture. I squared my shoulders. I lifted my chin to the angle I use in executive boardrooms when I am about to present findings that will change the direction of a meeting. I walked to the head of the long glass dining table and turned to face the room. The terrified, obedient, apron-wearing woman who had spent 3 days cooking Wagyu beef and polishing wine glasses in the shadows did not exist anymore. Or rather, she had never existed in any real sense. She had been a performance, carefully maintained for a specific strategic purpose. What stood at the head of the table now was the corporate executive who managed multi-million-dollar financial divisions and had been doing so, quietly and without credit, for the entirety of this marriage. I channeled every ounce of the authority I carried in that professional context and let it occupy the room completely. Derek panicked with the immediacy of someone who recognizes, too late, far too late, that the situation has moved irrevocably beyond his ability to manage. He lurched forward, his face cycling rapidly through several shades of red and arriving at something deep and suffused, the color of anger that has nowhere productive to go. "Olivia, get back in the kitchen right now," he hissed, his voice a strained, trembling combination of command and desperation that had the architectural integrity of wet paper. He turned to Richard with a desperate, entirely unconvincing laugh that sounded like something breaking. "Richard, I sincerely apologize for this interruption. My wife is under considerable stress from her accounting work. She is not connected to this company or this proposal in any professional capacity. She has no role here tonight. Please, if we could just return to—" I did not look at him. I simply raised my right hand, palm facing outward, in the single, clean gesture I use to stop a room. I locked my eyes onto his face with the particular quality of attention I reserve for people who are lying to me in a professional setting and have run out of time to stop. "Stop talking, Derek." My voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried the same cold, absolute precision it carries when I shut down a regional director who is falsifying quarterly expense data, and it cut through the warm dining room air with the same effect, a physical change in the atmosphere of the room. Complete, immediate silence. Derek's mouth closed. His shoulders dropped. He took one step backward with the involuntary compliance of someone whose body has recognized an authority his mind is still refusing to accept. And he stood there with the paralyzed, diminished quality of a man watching a version of reality he had never once prepared for. I turned my full attention to Richard and his legal team with the smooth, practiced transition of someone moving between agenda items in a meeting that has been running long. "Richard, I want to begin by acknowledging that your analysts did excellent work in flagging the irregularities in his proposal," I said, keeping my register completely measured and professionally calibrated. "However, your risk assessment team, working from publicly available information, was only able to identify the surface layer of what is actually occurring here. They correctly classified his business model as fraudulent. I am standing at this table to clarify, with documentation, exactly how that fraud was being financed and what additional crimes have been committed in the process of funding it." Barbara came out of her chair with the explosive, uncontained energy of a woman who has been sitting on a detonation for the past 4 minutes and has finally lost the capacity to hold it. "Don't you dare!" Barbara shrieked, the words cracking at their edges with the force of her volume. Her sequined dress caught the chandelier light in a dozen directions as she rose. Do not say another word, Olivia. You are going to destroy everything. You are going to ruin his entire future over your own petty, vindictive jealousy. Her voice had reached the register of someone who has abandoned strategy entirely and is operating on pure, cornered instinct. You have never once believed in him. You have never supported his vision. This is about your ego, not his crimes. You are just jealous because you will never possess his entrepreneurial spirit, no matter how many corporate titles you collect. I turned my head slowly and looked at my mother-in-law. I felt, with complete and total clarity, absolutely no pity for the woman who had collected my father's photograph from the wall of my own home and placed it in a garbage bag 2 days ago. I felt nothing for the woman who had poured scalding coffee over my laptop with a smirk and called it an accident. I looked at her with the specific, focused calm of someone who has already decided exactly what is going to happen and is simply waiting for the room to catch up. "Barbara," I said, and my voice had dropped into a register so quiet and so steady that it required the room to go completely silent in order to be heard, which it did, instantly. "I am going to ask you to sit down and remain silent for the remainder of this conversation." I held her eyes without blinking. "The reason I am asking you to do that, and I want to be entirely clear about this, is that you have been an active, enabling participant in everything that has occurred in this house over the past 3 days. You moved yourself into my home to supervise a criminal enterprise. You disposed of my personal property to facilitate it. You encouraged and validated every decision that led to this moment. What I am about to disclose involves severe criminal activity, and the degree of your knowing involvement in facilitating that activity is something you should consider very carefully before you say another word in front of 2 corporate attorneys with legal pads." The word criminal landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Immediate, concentric, reaching every surface. Both lawyers moved simultaneously, clicking their pens and repositioning their legal pads with the coordinated efficiency of men shifting into a different operational mode. Kelsey pressed her spine back against the wall behind her chair, as though the additional 2 inches of distance might constitute meaningful separation from what was coming. Richard remained perfectly still, watching me with the focused, respectful attention of a man who has just upgraded his assessment of the situation he walked into. I turned back to the table and to Richard. "The man standing behind me did not build a technology startup," I said, projecting my voice with the clear, deliberate enunciation of someone who wants every syllable on record. "He has not written a single line of proprietary code. He does not possess a registered patent, a working prototype, a beta testing cohort, or a legally constituted corporate entity of any kind. What he possesses is a profound and sustained allergy to honest work, a limitless ego that requires constant, expensive maintenance, and a willingness to fund that maintenance through whatever means are immediately available to him, regardless of who they belong to." I paused for exactly 1 beat. Then I raised my right hand and pointed 1 finger directly at Derek's chest. "3 days ago, this man accessed the protected 529 college savings account that I personally established and funded for our twin children. He bypassed the account security questions, changed the administrative login credentials and recovery email address, locked me out of the portal entirely, and drained the complete balance. I let the number enter the room by itself, clearly and without softening. $45,000. Every cent I had saved over 5 years of working double shifts, taking on freelance clients on Sunday afternoons, investing holiday bonuses instead of spending them on myself. Everything I had set aside to ensure that Leo and Mia would never have to begin their adult lives, burdened by predatory student loan debt. He took every single penny of his own children's educational future and used it as a down payment on an ego. The dining room held a silence that had a specific physical quality. The silence of people who are processing information that is worse than what they had anticipated walking in. Richard stared at Derek across the length of the table with an expression of pure, undiluted disgust that he made no effort whatsoever to moderate or conceal. "Stealing from your own infant children to finance a fabricated corporate image," Richard said, his voice having dropped into a low, venomous register that seemed to bypass the air entirely and arrive directly in the chest. "That is a new category of pathetic, even by the standards of the amateur con artists I have had the misfortune of encountering over the years." Derek's body had begun producing visible physical symptoms of systemic panic. He was pulling at the collar of his expensive tailored suit with one hand, the fabric bunching above his tie, his breath coming in the shallow, effortful rhythm of someone whose chest is not cooperating. His eyes moved around the room with the wild, darting quality of an animal that has just registered that every exit is covered. "It was a temporary loan," he managed, the words pushing out between uneven breaths. "A short-term bridge. I was going to replace every dollar the moment we finalized the funding tonight, Richard. I want you to understand the context. I needed to project an image of serious, established success in order to attract capital at this level. You cannot walk into a high net worth conversation looking like you are struggling." The optics were a strategic necessity. "The truck was only the beginning," I said, continuing without pause and without looking at him. "I had the floor, and I intended to use every inch of it." I shifted my gaze deliberately to Kelsey, who had gone so still she appeared to have stopped breathing entirely. Her eyes had the wide, fixed quality of someone watching a vehicle approaching them from a direction they cannot move away from. He also used a portion of those same stolen funds to pay his ex-girlfriend a $5,000 retainer fee to attend this dinner in the role of a fabricated co-founder and present herself to an angel investor as a legitimate officer of his non-existent company. Kelsey produced a small, compressed, involuntary sound and covered her mouth with both hands simultaneously, her perfectly manicured fingers pressing hard against her lips. Both of Richard's lawyers began writing with the focused, rapid energy of men who have just been handed something specific and actionable, their pens moving across their legal pads in the sustained, purposeful way that indicates documentation rather than notes. Derek was completely and geometrically trapped. He had invited the executioner to dinner. I had just handed the billionaire the axe and pointed at the block. But I knew, and had known for 3 days, that the college fund theft and the fraudulent co-founder retainer were the opening chapters. It was time to introduce the evidence that Jamal had assembled in the red folder with the care and precision of a man who had spent his career preparing exactly this kind of case. I turned away from the table for a single, unhurried moment and walked to the mahogany console near the front entryway. Inside the top drawer, exactly where I had placed it that afternoon, while Derek was critiquing my truffle placement, was the thick red folder Jamal had pressed into my hands across a coffee shop table 2 days ago. I withdrew it, feeling the satisfying solidity of its contents against my palm, the specific weight of documented truth, and walked directly back to where Derek was standing with his hand braced on the edge of the presentation monitor. He was still attempting to locate the words for a defense. He did not find them in time. I placed the red folder on the center of his empty presentation plate with a single, controlled motion. The impact of heavy cardstock against fine china produced a sharp, clean sound that moved through the dining room and landed in every person's chest. I flipped the folder open, revealing the dense stack of banking documents bearing the institutional logo of a major national financial organization. "If stealing from your children had been the totality of your crimes," I said, allowing the silence around the statement to give it its full weight, "you might have emerged from this with a divorce, a destroyed reputation, and a civil judgment. The federal government might have stayed out of it entirely." I placed my index finger on the top page of the home equity line of credit agreement. "But your greed is not the kind that recognizes limits." I looked at Richard. then at his lawyers, then back at the table. 3 weeks ago, this man decided that $45,000 was insufficient to fund his ambitions. He went online and submitted an application for a $100,000 home equity line of credit against this property. I paused. The same property that he signed over to me in its entirety, via a legally executed and county-recorded quit-claim deed 14 months ago. Richard leaned forward across the table, his sharp eyes moving across the upside-down document with the practiced speed of someone who reads financial instruments for a living. One of his lawyers half rose from his chair, adjusting his glasses to bring the paperwork into clearer focus. Since this property is recorded exclusively in my name, I continued, tracing the blue ink on the final signature page with one finger. The bank's loan approval process required my explicit, in-person signature and a verified, commissioned public notary to certify the document as legally binding. I looked up from the page and around the table. So, he forged my signature. He reproduced my handwriting using a tracing technique, likely from an existing check or piece of official correspondence, and fabricated my consent in writing on a federal banking document. I moved my finger to the notary stamp. And then he had one of the men who was drinking craft beer on my patio Tuesday night purchase a counterfeit notary commission stamp from an online marketplace for approximately $20 and used that stamp to certify the forged document as having been executed in my verified presence before a licensed official. The entire application was submitted digitally to bypass the requirement of sitting in front of an actual loan officer who might have asked questions. Derek had both hands on the edge of the dining table. His knuckles had gone the color of paper. Olivia. His voice had been reduced to something barely above a whisper. A thin, cracked, desperate sound that contained none of the authority or arrogance that had occupied it for the past 3 days. Please. Stop. We can still fix this. I can make calls. I can reverse the transfer. I can put everything back. You cannot cancel anything, Derek, I said, and the quietness of my voice was the most final thing I had ever said to him. The loan was approved. The funds were deposited into your personal checking account. And at approximately 5 o'clock this evening, while I was in this kitchen preparing your 5-course gourmet dinner, pressing Wagyu beef to the correct internal temperature, and polishing your wine glasses for water spots, you completed a wire transfer of the full $100,000 to an unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchange registered in a jurisdiction specifically chosen for its non-compliance with United States federal tax and financial reporting law. The second lawyer set his pen down on the table. The sound of it was very small in the silent room, but it carried. He looked at Derek across the table with an expression that had moved entirely beyond professional courtesy into something rawer and more fundamental. You wired fraudulently obtained funds across international borders, the lawyer said, his voice flat and stripped of everything except the factual content of the statement. You did this tonight, while you were in this house, while this woman was preparing your dinner. He looked at his colleague, then back at Derek. Are you genuinely operating under the belief that this sequence of events has no consequences? Richard did not wait for Derek's response. He turned to his lead counsel with the clipped, decisive energy of someone issuing operational orders. Document everything said in this room from the point of my arrival, Richard said, his voice stripped to its professional core. I need a complete, time-stamped record establishing unambiguously that this corporation had zero prior knowledge of this individual's criminal activities before entering this property tonight. I will not have the Harrison Group's name anywhere near a federal financial crimes investigation as anything other than a reporting party. I looked at Richard and nodded. Exactly. And to be precise about the legal classifications involved, I turned back to Derek and looked at him with the steady, clear-eyed focus of someone reading from a prepared statement. ensuring that each charge landed with its full, documented weight. You committed aggravated identity theft by using my personal identifying information to execute financial transactions without my knowledge or consent. You committed federal bank fraud by defrauding a federally insured financial institution through the submission of falsified documents and forged credentials. And because you used an interstate digital network to transfer those fraudulently obtained funds across state lines to an international server, you have completed the elements of felony wire fraud under federal statute. I paused, allowing each charge to occupy its own space in the room. These are not misdemeanor infractions. These are Class C felonies carrying mandatory minimum sentences in a federal penitentiary. The kind of sentences that are not negotiated down through good behavior or expensive attorneys, the kind that are served. The gravity of the charges pressed down on the room with the physical weight of something structural. The two lawyers were writing with the focused, continuous energy of men who understand that what they are transcribing will be read by people in federal buildings. Richard's expression had the particular quality of someone who came to do one thing and has discovered they are in the middle of something significantly larger. Barbara had both hands pressed flat over her mouth, her shoulders heaving with the irregular, involuntary rhythm of someone crying without being willing to make the sound. The specific, suffocating grief of a woman watching the collapse of a narrative she had spent decades constructing and defending. She had spent her entire life standing between her son and the consequences of his decisions. She had never once imagined a consequence built from federal statutes and documented wire transfers that no amount of maternal intervention could reshape. And then, in the corner of my field of vision, I caught a movement. Kelsey was not waiting for the conclusion of the scene she had stepped into. She had clearly identified the specific legal nature of her own position, had calculated the distance between $5,000 retainer paid from a fraudulent wire transfer and knowing accessory to federal financial crimes, and had made a practical, if undignified, decision about what to do with that information. She was pushing her rented velvet chair away from the table with both hands, moving with the careful, graduated stealth of someone who hopes the act of leaving will not draw more attention than staying. Her face was completely drained of blood. The coral workout set, the designer tote bag, the carefully arranged hair, all of it looked suddenly and absolutely absurd on a person trying to quietly evacuate a federal crime scene through a back door. She did not look at Derek. She did not look at Barbara. She kept her eyes on the floor, picked up her oversized tote bag with both hands, and moved in small, backward, incremental steps away from the table until she reached the sliding glass door to the patio. She eased it open with one hand, the cold, wet air from outside rushing in for a moment. And then she slipped through the gap and was gone, out into the pouring rain, the self-appointed brand consultant and fake co-founder. Abandoning the visionary CEO she had been paid $5,000 stolen dollars to elevate, leaving him to complete his drowning alone. The glass door clicked shut behind her. I looked down at Derek, who was staring at the open red folder on his presentation plate with the fixed, unblinking quality of a man staring at something his brain has decided not to fully process. In less than 10 minutes, working from a position he had assigned me, silent, invisible, serving from the kitchen doorway, I had dismantled the entire fabricated architecture of his life. The presentation was in ruins, the fraud was documented, the money was gone, the truck was gone. His co-founder had fled through the back door into the rain, and his wife's boss was standing in his dining room with 2 lawyers and legal pads full of evidence. He had nothing left to project success with. The heavy, absolute silence of the dining room was shattered by a sound from outside that arrived through the floor before it arrived through the ears. A deep, mechanical roar accompanied by the distinctive hydraulic hiss of heavy equipment releasing pressure. a vibration that traveled up through the hardwood and into the soles of my feet. Derek blinked. He pulled his eyes away from the red folder with visible effort and looked toward the large bay windows at the front of the house. Through the rain-slicked glass, amber strobe lights were pulsing through the darkness, flashing rhythmically, reflecting off the wet surface of the window in erratic, sweeping arcs, casting yellow shadows across the rented velvet furniture in patterns that had nothing to do with the interior lighting of a successful pitch dinner. Richard and both lawyers turned simultaneously toward the window with the coordinated attention of people responding to an unexpected development. Barbara stopped her silent sobbing for a suspended moment, wiping the mascara from beneath her eyes with the back of one hand and peering at the strobing light with bewildered red-rimmed eyes. I stood perfectly still, my arms folded across my chest, and waited. Derek crossed the dining room in 3 unsteady strides and pushed into the living room, pressing his face against the cold glass of the front bay window. His breath fogged the pane immediately. Outside, illuminated in the harsh, strobing amber of industrial warning lights, were 2 massive, heavy-duty commercial tow trucks. They had not parked on the street or in the driveway. They had driven directly up onto the front lawn, their enormous tires cutting deep, decisive trenches through the carefully maintained grass, and had positioned themselves on either side of Derek's prized midnight black Ford Raptor with the practiced efficiency of crews who had done this many times and did not plan to stay long. 3 men in high-visibility rain jackets were moving with focused, rapid professionalism across the wet lawn, dragging heavy steel recovery chains and positioning hydraulic wheel lifts under the front and rear axles of the vehicle. "What are they doing?" Derek's voice cracked into something close to a shriek. He slapped one open palm against the glass with a sound that reverberated through the living room. "That is my truck. They are going to scratch the paint." He was already fumbling at the deadbolt of the front door with both hands, throwing it open with a force that sent it back against its stop. The cold, wet air of the November evening rushed in immediately, carrying rain and the diesel smell of idling engines. Derek stepped onto the covered front porch and threw both arms in the air, his voice carrying out into the storm with the desperate, furious volume of a man who has not yet accepted that volume is no longer a relevant variable. "Hey, get away from that vehicle right now. You cannot park on my lawn. I am calling the police." One of the men in high-visibility rain gear crouched at the front axle, securing a heavy chain with practiced efficiency, did not look up. He raised his voice just enough to carry over the engine noise without effort. "Sir, I have a legally executed emergency repossession order for this vehicle. If you step off that porch and physically interfere with a lawful recovery operation, I will contact local law enforcement and have you detained for obstruction." Derek stopped at the edge of the porch. The rain blew sideways under the cover and soaked the front of his charcoal suit in a matter of seconds, darkening the fabric from the lapels down. He turned back toward the house, and the look on his face when he found me standing in the foyer, calm, arms folded, watching, was something that belonged to a specific category of human expression that I had never seen on him before. The look of a person who has just collided at full speed with the end of the road. "Olivia." His voice had been reduced to something entirely unrecognizable from the commanding, condescending instrument it had been 72 hours ago. It was small and broken and wet. "Call them off, please. Tell them there has been a mistake. The dealership specifically promised a 30-day grace period before the first payment was required." Richard and his 2 lawyers had followed quietly from the dining room and were standing in a loose line in the foyer, bearing witness with the detached, attentive quality of people watching a demonstration of something instructive. I looked at my husband standing on the porch in the rain with his expensive suit soaked through and his status symbol being lifted off the driveway by hydraulic equipment, and I felt something that was not quite pity and not quite satisfaction. something cleaner and more permanent than either. "There is no mistake, Derek," I said. I kept my voice completely level and projected it clearly enough for him to hear over the diesel engines. "And this has nothing to do with a missed payment." He stared at me through the rain, water running down his face from his slicked back hair. "Then why?" The question came out stripped of everything. No arrogance, no performance, nothing left but the raw, uncomprehending confusion of someone watching their constructed world come apart faster than they can process it. "Because I made several phone calls this afternoon," I told him, "while I was in the kitchen preparing your gourmet 5-course dinner." I allowed a brief pause. Not for effect, simply because the information deserved its own space. The first call was to the auto insurance carrier. I informed them that the initial premium payment for the policy on this vehicle had been funded using money stolen from a federally protected 529 college savings account. The carrier immediately flagged the policy for fraud and canceled the coverage effective same day. It is a legal requirement to maintain comprehensive insurance on any financed vehicle. Without active coverage, the financing agreement becomes void. Derek's mouth opened and produced nothing. The second call was to the finance department at the luxury dealership. I continued, my voice carrying the measured, unhurried precision of a regional finance manager presenting findings to an executive board. I introduced myself as your wife and as the documented sole financial provider for this household. I forwarded them 5 consecutive years of your official filed tax returns, which reflect a total reported income of $0. I then informed them that the proof of income documentation you submitted to qualify for the vehicle loan had been entirely fabricated. One of Richard's lawyers produced a low, involuntary sound, a short, appreciative exhale that was not quite a whistle but occupied the same register. "You committed loan application fraud," I continued. "The dealership's legal team reviewed my documentation and concluded they had issued an $80,000 asset to an individual with no verifiable income using a stolen down payment on the basis of falsified qualifying documents. They revoked the financing agreement and issued an emergency repossession order within the hour, specifically designed to recover the vehicle before it could be hidden, transferred, or otherwise removed from their reach." Outside, a loud, definitive metallic engagement. The sound of the hydraulic lift system locking into position cut through the rain. The front end of the midnight black Ford Raptor rose smoothly and with complete indifference into the wet night air, its gleaming chrome rims catching the amber strobes and spinning freely, going nowhere, reflecting light into the dark suburban street for the last time. Derek did not run down the porch steps. He did not wave his arms again or shout into the storm. He simply leaned against the doorframe with both hands and watched, in absolute, complete silence, as the tow truck driver completed his checks, climbed back into the cab of the massive rig, and engaged the transmission with a heavy, final clunk. The truck pulled forward slowly, drawing the Raptor behind it on its lift with the unhurried certainty of something that was always going to happen and has now simply arrived. The second tow truck fell into line immediately behind the first, their amber lights strobing in steady, rhythmic unison as they moved down the dark suburban street and disappeared from view, leaving behind nothing but 2 long, deep, muddy ruts carved into the lawn and the gradually fading sound of diesel engines retreating into the rain. The $80,000 executive vehicle, the down payment for which had been taken from 2 sleeping toddlers' college savings, the monthly payments for which would have been funded by money that did not exist, the purpose of which had been to perform a success that had never been real, was gone. And with it went the last structural element of the identity Derek had been constructing and protecting at everyone else's expense for 3 years. There was nothing left to project. Nothing left to perform. Nothing left. Derek remained against the doorframe, wet and completely motionless, staring at the empty space in the driveway where the truck had been. He did not speak. The diesel sound faded further and further, and then it was gone entirely. And what remained was just the rain and the dark street and the muddy lawn and the man who had orchestrated it all, standing at the threshold of his own consequences. But while Derek was suspended in the paralysis of sudden, complete collapse, his mother was experiencing an entirely different response. The 5 minutes of shocked, compressed silence that had held Barbara in her chair finally gave way. What replaced it was not grief or acceptance or any kind of reckoning. It was rage. The explosive, irrational, cornered rage of a woman who has never once been required to absorb the consequences of the choices she spent a lifetime enabling in someone else. Barbara pushed herself out of the rented velvet chair and crossed the room with the aggressive, purposeful energy of someone who has decided that the correct response to the situation is to attack it. Her sequined dress caught the chandelier light from the dining room behind her, throwing fractured reflections across the walls as she moved. Her heels struck the hardwood floor with the sharp, staccato rhythm of someone who wants to be heard approaching. She stopped several feet in front of me and pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, her arm fully extended, her entire body shaking with the force of what she was containing. "You vindictive, ungrateful, small-minded witch." The words came out at a volume that would have registered in neighboring houses. "How dare you? How dare you humiliate my son in front of people who matter? You called the dealership and had them take his truck. You sabotaged his investor dinner. You stood in his dining room and systematically destroyed everything he has worked to build, because you are too limited, too jealous, and too fundamentally small to endure the sight of a man with real vision succeeding where you never could." I did not step back. I did not flinch. I looked at the woman who had moved herself into my home, thrown my father's photograph into a garbage bag, poured scalding coffee over my work equipment with a smirk, demanded I liquidate my retirement savings to purchase furniture for a fraud scheme, and told me in front of my children's future babysitters that I had an impoverished mindset, and I felt nothing that resembled the instinct to retreat. "He destroyed his own future," I said. My voice was completely quiet and completely final. "I provided the documentation." Barbara's face contorted with the particular fury of a woman receiving an answer she had not prepared for. She slammed one hand down on the mahogany console beside her, with a force that rattled the frame on top of it. "That is it," she announced, her chest working in visible, uneven heaves. "I am done watching you disrespect and undermine this family. I want you out of this house. Tonight. Right now. Go upstairs, collect your cheap little work suits and your pathetic little personal items, and get out. I am removing you from my son's home. You do not get to dismantle his life and then sleep under his roof." She drew herself up to her full height with the authority of someone delivering a verdict that cannot be appealed. "This house belongs to a visionary. You are no longer welcome in it." Richard Harrison, who had been standing in the foyer with the quiet, observational stillness of a man who has seen a great many remarkable things in his professional life, produced a short, dry, involuntary sound. Not quite a laugh, but the auditory equivalent of an incredulous shake of the head. He did not say anything. He did not need to. I looked at Barbara for a moment, just long enough to ensure that what I was about to do had her complete and undivided attention. Then I turned and walked back into the dining room, where the red folder was still lying open on Derek's presentation plate. I leafed through the contents with practiced efficiency, past the HELOC agreement, past the forged signature page, past the wire transfer confirmation, until I found the document at the very back of the stack, the one bearing the embossed blue seal of the county clerk's office. I pulled it free from the folder, turned around, and walked back into the foyer, holding it with both hands. "Barbara," I said. My voice had dropped into the register I use when I need a room to be completely quiet and to stay that way. The register that does not invite interruption. She stopped. Before you complete that sentence, I would like to read something aloud that I think you will find directly relevant to the specific threat you are currently making. I held the document up at an angle that allowed the foyer light to fall across the text clearly. I spoke each word with deliberate, unhurried enunciation, ensuring that every syllable was audible and unambiguous to every person present. This quitclaim deed, executed on the 14th of October by Derek, hereby identified as the grantor, releases and forever quit claims to Olivia, hereby identified as the grantee, all rights, title, interest, and claim to the real property located at this address. I lowered the document and looked at my mother-in-law directly. Do you understand what that language means, Barbara? It means that 14 months ago, when your brilliant visionary of a son was facing federal tax penalties and was terrified of having a government lien placed on his assets, he came to me in tears in this kitchen and begged, to accept complete and sole legal ownership of this property so he could hide his assets from the Internal Revenue Service and avoid the consequences of his own financial crimes. I paused. He was crying when he signed it. He swore it was temporary. He promised he would get a real job. And then he did none of those things, and instead committed additional, larger crimes. But the deed stands regardless of his intentions. Barbara's face underwent a transformation that moved through several distinct stages: incomprehension, calculation, verification, and finally the specific absolute pallor of someone arriving at a conclusion they cannot reject. She looked past me toward the front door, where Derek was still standing in the wet, and I watched the precise moment when she registered that he was not going to contradict what I had just said, because he could not. He knew exactly what he had signed. He remembered every word of the conversation in which he had signed it. He had given it all to me. I am the sole legal owner of the ground you are standing on right now, I said, taking one measured step toward her. Derek is not the lord of the manor. He is a tenant who has just completed multiple counts of federal wire fraud against his landlord. Which means that you— I allowed the implication to arrive on its own before I completed it— are not standing in your son's house. You are standing in my house. You have been standing in my house for the past 2 days, treating me as your domestic employee, in a property that is mine by every legal and documented definition of the word. Barbara stumbled backward. Her heel caught on the edge of the rented area rug and she went back against the wall, her hands flying up reflexively to cover her mouth. The sequined dress, the measuring tape she had worn around her neck that first afternoon, the 3 massive hard-shell suitcases stacked in my foyer, all of it suddenly occupied a completely different context. The diamond rings she had flashed under my pendant lights, the wine she had poured from my bottles, the confident, sweeping authority with which she had instructed delivery men to rearrange my furniture. All of it had been conducted inside a house that had never, for a single day of our acquaintance, belonged to her son. Since this is my property, I said, and I allowed my voice to carry the full, quiet weight of the legal and moral authority I had just documented in front of 2 corporate lawyers and a billionaire. I am exercising my right as the sole title holder to remove unwanted parties from my premises. I looked at her steadily. You brought 3 large suitcases into my home because you intended to take up permanent residence here and continue treating me as your domestic staff. You have exactly 10 minutes to collect those suitcases, carry them to your car, and remove yourself from my property. If you are still standing in my foyer at the conclusion of those 10 minutes, I will contact the police and request that you be physically removed on grounds of criminal trespassing. I held her eyes for exactly long enough for the statement to become a certainty rather than a threat. I suggest you start with the largest suitcase first. Barbara let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper that seemed to bounce off every wall in the room. She looked at Richard as though the billionaire investor might somehow intervene and rescue her from the full weight of this humiliation, but Richard simply glanced down at his expensive wristwatch and raised a deliberate, unhurried eyebrow in her direction. "You heard the woman?" Richard stated coldly. "The clock is ticking." Barbara let out a loud, defeated sob and frantically scrambled toward the guest room to pack her bags. The ultimate weapon she had convinced herself she possessed had just blown up spectacularly in her face. I stood in my dining room, the quit-claim deed held firmly and deliberately in my hand, completely and utterly in control of my own home. The sound of heavy, frantic footsteps echoed down the hallway as Barbara began tearing her belongings apart in the guest room. Derek was still standing motionless in the foyer, the cold rain dripping from his ruined tailored suit and forming a dark, spreading puddle on the hardwood floor. He watched his mother abandon him without a second glance, and then he slowly turned his head to look directly at me. The sheer panic in his eyes began to curdle into something far darker and considerably more desperate. He reached out, grabbed the brass handle of the heavy mahogany front door, and shoved it shut with both hands, sealing the two of us inside together. He marched toward the dining room with measured, purposeful strides. He did not look like a visionary tech founder anymore. He looked like a cornered, dangerous animal backed into the last available corner. He stopped just inches away from me, using every inch of his height to loom over me, deliberately attempting to cast a shadow of physical intimidation. The smell of wet wool and cheap cologne radiated off him in waves, mixing with the sharp metallic scent of his own fear. "You are going to fix this," Derek hissed, his chest heaving with erratic, shallow breaths. "You are going to sign that deed back over to me right now. I want my name back on this house, Olivia. If I have collateral, I can secure a legitimate loan to pay off the bank and the dealership. You are my wife, and you are going to save me from this mess." I did not take a single step backward. I did not flinch or look away. I simply looked up at his red, contorted face with absolute and complete disgust. "I am not signing anything, Derek," I stated, my voice smooth and entirely unbothered. "And you cannot use this house to pay off the bank because you already stole $100,000 of its equity. There is absolutely nothing left here for you to take from me." Derek raised his hand, pointing a shaking, accusatory finger right between my eyes. He stepped even closer, completely invading my personal space with practiced aggression. "You listen to me," he growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous, violent whisper. "I am not going down for this alone. You are going to call the authorities and tell them you personally authorized that home equity loan. You are going to tell them you simply forgot you had signed it. You are going to take the fall for the notary, or I swear to God I will make every single day of your life a living hell." Before I could tell him that his hollow threats meant absolutely nothing to me whatsoever, Richard Harrison intervened. The billionaire investor did not simply stand by and observe the spectacle. He took a heavy, commanding step forward, his own powerful presence instantly dwarfing Derek's pathetic display of aggression. One of the lawyers immediately reached inside his suit jacket, pulling out his cell phone to dial emergency services without being asked. "Step away from her this very second," Richard ordered, his voice echoing through the room like a clap of thunder. "If you lay a single finger on my finance manager, I will personally ensure my legal team bankrupts you into complete oblivion before you ever see the inside of a courtroom." Derek turned his head to snap back at Richard, his fists clenching tightly at his sides. But before he could utter even a single syllable of defiance, 3 loud, heavy knocks hammered against the front door. It was not the polite, tentative knock of a dinner guest or a curious neighbor. It was the sharp, authoritative strike of law enforcement announcing itself. The brass handle clicked, and the front door was pushed open from the outside, throwing the cold wind and driving rain back into the foyer. Stepping over the threshold, looking absolutely immaculate in a tailored charcoal topcoat, was Jamal. My brother-in-law took one measured look at Derek's aggressive posture, the clenched fists, and the flushed, furious face, and let out a cold, humorless scoff that cut through the tension like a blade. "I highly suggest you back away from my sister-in-law, Derek," Jamal said smoothly, shaking the rainwater from his umbrella with practiced calm. "Unless you want to add aggravated assault to your rapidly growing list of federal charges." Derek spun around, his face draining entirely of whatever color it had retained. Walking into the house directly behind Jamal were two broad-shouldered uniformed police officers. Their expressions were stern and unreadable, and their hands rested with practiced caution on their heavy-duty belts. Flanking them was a tall man wearing a plain dark tactical jacket with a silver badge hanging prominently from a chain around his neck. The detective held a thick manila envelope firmly in his right hand. The air in the living room seemed to evaporate entirely. The aggressive, intimidating husband who had just threatened me was instantly replaced by a trembling, terrified fraud. Jamal walked calmly and deliberately into the living room, nodding respectfully to Richard and the legal team before turning his dark, calculating eyes squarely onto Derek. "I told you I would have the data packet ready before the dessert course," Jamal said, offering me a brief, quietly proud smile. "The Regional Financial Crimes Task Force works incredibly fast when you hand them an airtight forensic trail." The detective stepped forward, his boots leaving precise wet tracks on the hardwood floor. He bypassed the rented velvet furniture and stopped directly in front of Derek. He opened the manila envelope and pulled out a substantial stack of official court-stamped documents. "Derek," the detective said, his voice flat and strictly professional, "we have a warrant for your arrest." The detective stepped fully into the foyer, his wet boots squeaking slightly against the hardwood floor. He held the thick manila envelope up, his expression completely devoid of even the smallest trace of sympathy. Derek took a trembling step backward, his back pressing against the wall, as the reality of the situation finally breached his thick walls of delusion. "I am Detective Miller with the Regional Financial Crimes Task Force," the detective announced, his voice carrying a heavy, authoritative weight that left no room for negotiation. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of aggravated identity theft, bank fraud, and felony wire fraud." The district attorney reviewed the forensic data packet submitted by Jamal earlier today. "We tracked the $100,000 fraudulent loan you took out against this property. And we monitored the automated clearinghouse when you wired those stolen funds to an unregulated offshore server exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes ago." Jamal stood comfortably near the front door, watching the scene unfold with the quiet, settled satisfaction of a man who had successfully cornered his prey after a long and careful hunt. He looked at Derek and shook his head slowly. "You left a digital trail a mile wide, Derek," Jamal said smoothly. "You used a fake notary registration that had expired 3 years ago, and you wired the funds from the exact same network you use to check your daily social media accounts. Forensic accounting is only difficult when the criminal is actually smart." Derek shook his head frantically, holding his hands up in a desperate gesture of surrender. "No," he pleaded, his voice cracking into a humiliatingly high pitch. "You do not understand. I am an entrepreneur. I was securing venture capital. The money was just a temporary bridge loan for my startup. I am hosting a pitch dinner right now with a billionaire investor. Look at him. He is standing right there." The detective did not even blink at the pathetic excuse. He gestured toward the two uniformed officers standing beside him. "Secure him," the detective ordered without hesitation. The two officers stepped forward in unison. Derek tried to press himself further into the wall, but there was simply nowhere left to go. One officer grabbed his left arm, spinning him around firmly but with practiced professionalism. The other officer grabbed his right arm, pulling it firmly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around Derek's wrists echoed loudly and clearly through the foyer. It was the absolute, undeniable finality of that sound that made Derek's knees buckle beneath him. The officers had to steady him by his elbows to prevent him from collapsing entirely onto the floor. The expensive tailored charcoal suit he had purchased with stolen money was now wrinkled and thoroughly soaked with rain, providing a devastating and pathetic contrast to the heavy steel restraints binding his hands behind his back. I stood silently near the dining room entrance, watching the man who had ordered me to serve his guests and act like hired help in my own home, now being handled exactly like the criminal he truly was. Richard Harrison stood just a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest in quiet authority. His two lawyers were actually taking careful notes on their legal pads, methodically documenting every detail of the arrest to ensure their firm was entirely insulated from Derek's catastrophic and radioactive legal fallout. Derek turned his head, his cheek pressing uncomfortably against the cold wall as the officers patted his pockets to search for contraband. He looked desperately at Richard, his eyes wide with a manic, entirely delusional hope. "Richard," Derek begged, his voice trembling violently. "Please, you are a powerful man. You have corporate lawyers. Tell them this is a misunderstanding. Tell them we are actively doing business together. I can still give you a significant equity stake in the app." Richard looked down at Derek with an expression of profound and unfiltered disgust. "We are not doing business together, Derek," Richard stated, his voice as cold and final as ice. "You pitched a fraudulent concept with the sole intention of stealing my money, just as you stole your own child's college fund and your wife's home equity. You are a parasite. If you ever contact my company or my finance manager again, I will personally ensure my legal team makes the remainder of your life an absolute and relentless misery." Derek's delusional hope shattered completely and irreversibly in that moment. He finally and fully understood that his tech founder persona was dead. He was not a visionary. He was a felon in handcuffs. He slowly turned his head away from the billionaire and looked at me. The arrogant husband who had micromanaged my cooking, mocked my corporate career, and casually invited his ex-girlfriend into my kitchen as though I did not exist, was completely and permanently gone. In his place was a pathetic, terrified man begging for his mother. But his mother was currently in the guest room frantically shoving her belongings into bags to avoid being arrested for trespassing. "Olivia," Derek sobbed, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes and mixing with the rainwater already streaking down his face. "Please, you are my wife. You promised to stand by me. Call a defense attorney, get the house appraised and post my bail. You cannot let them take me to federal holding. I will not survive in there. I am so sorry. Just pay the bail. Please." I looked at him steadily. I remembered the 5 years of double shifts I had worked to save $45,000 for our children's future. I remembered the feeling of absolute sheer panic when I first saw the zero balance staring back at me from my banking app. I remembered him handing me a grocery list for Wagyu beef and imported truffles, while knowing full well he had left me with exactly $200 to my name. I felt absolutely nothing for him. No pity, no sadness, no grief. Only the clean, refreshing, crystalline clarity of total and complete victory. I took a slow step forward, stopping just slightly beyond his reach. I looked him dead in the eye, watching the sheer terror radiating uncontrollably from his face. I kept my voice perfectly level, completely and deliberately devoid of emotion, and delivered the exact reality he had single-handedly created for himself. "I would, Derek," I said softly. "But you drained my savings. Good luck with the public defender." The detective gave a short, decisive nod, signaling the two officers to move. They guided Derek forward by his arms, leading him out through the foyer and into the harsh, driving rain. Derek did not fight them. He did not look back at me again. His shoulders were slumped entirely, his head hanging low, the rain instantly plastering his hair flat against his forehead. I watched as they walked him slowly down the same driveway where his $80,000 truck had been repossessed just minutes before. A police cruiser was parked on the street, its red and blue lights slicing rhythmically through the dark, stormy night. An officer pressed a firm but measured hand to the top of Derek's head, guiding him carefully into the back seat, and slammed the heavy door shut. The stark, resonant finality of that metal click echoed all the way back up to the porch. Just as the police cruiser began to pull away from the curb, the sound of heavy plastic wheels clattering and scraping against the hardwood floor broke the sudden silence inside the house. Barbara emerged from the hallway, panting and struggling to drag her 3 massive, overpacked suitcases behind her. Her sequined dress looked entirely and grotesquely absurd given the circumstances surrounding her. She pushed her way to the front door, her eyes frantically scanning the empty, rain-soaked driveway. When she finally spotted the taillights of the police cruiser disappearing steadily down the street, she let out a gut-wrenching, hollow shriek that shook the walls. She dropped the handles of her luggage, leaving all 3 bags stranded awkwardly in the entryway, and practically threw herself onto the covered porch. "Derek!" she screamed desperately into the rain, her voice raw and frantic. "Bring him back! You cannot take my son!" She stood there for a long, drenched moment, getting thoroughly soaked by the wind-blown rain before slowly turning around to face me. The sheer, iron-plated arrogance that had defined her entire existence in my home was completely and utterly washed away. She was shivering, her mascara running down her face in thick, dramatic black streaks. She looked past me into the warm, brightly lit living room with its rented staging furniture, and then down helplessly at her 3 suitcases sitting abandoned by the door. She wrapped both arms tightly around herself, stepping cautiously back toward the threshold. "Olivia, please," Barbara whimpered, her teeth actually chattering. "It is pouring out here. I simply cannot drive safely in this weather. My vision is terrible at night, and I am far too upset to operate a vehicle responsibly. Just let me stay in the guest room for tonight. We can sort all of this out calmly in the morning. I promise I will not say a single word. Just let me come back inside." I stood squarely in the doorway, blocking her path without so much as shifting my weight. I looked at the woman who had deliberately poured scalding hot coffee over my work laptop in a calculated attempt to derail my career. I looked at the woman who had demanded I liquidate my retirement account to purchase a leather sofa she had chosen, and who had thrown my deceased father's framed photographs into the trash without a moment's hesitation or a single word of apology. "Your 10 minutes are up, Barbara," I said, my voice as cold and unforgiving as the storm raging behind her. "You said you wanted to personally supervise the house to ensure no one ruined your son's big break. Well, the break is very much over. And as you so eloquently pointed out earlier this evening, I am far too small-minded to appreciate your high society standards. I would absolutely hate to force a woman of your refined sensibilities to sleep under the modest roof of a simple bookkeeper." I reached down, grabbed the handles of her 3 heavy suitcases, and shoved them forcefully out onto the porch in one decisive motion. They crashed against the wet concrete with a satisfying clatter, one of them tipping over completely and spilling directly into a puddle. Barbara let out a loud, theatrical gasp, reaching frantically toward the doorframe. "Olivia, you absolutely cannot do this to family." "You stopped being my family the moment you helped him steal from my children," I replied evenly. "Get off my property." I stepped back into the foyer and grabbed the heavy brass handle of the mahogany door. I did not wait for her to formulate another pathetic excuse or bargaining position. I pulled the door firmly shut, the heavy solid wood silencing her cries instantly and completely. I reached up and turned the heavy brass deadbolt with a slow, deliberate hand, the loud, solid click securing my fortress against the world outside. Then I reached over to the wall switch and flicked off the exterior porch light, plunging her into complete and utter darkness. The house was suddenly, profoundly quiet. The suffocating, exhausting tension that had plagued my home for the past 3 days was entirely and completely gone. I let out a long, deep, unhurried exhale, feeling the accumulated weight drain from my shoulders with each passing second. I turned around to face the foyer. Jamal, Richard, and the two corporate lawyers were still standing there, watching me with expressions of deep and genuine respect. I offered them a warm, relaxed smile for the first time all evening, a real one, unguarded and unperformed. "Well," I said, clapping my hands together lightly. "I spent 4 hours preparing Wagyu beef ribeyes, saffron risotto, and fresh oysters. It is completely paid for, and it would be an absolute tragedy to allow a gourmet meal of that caliber to go to waste." Jamal grinned broadly, adjusting the polished cuffs of his suit with easy composure. "I am absolutely starving," he admitted warmly, "and I believe we have a great deal to celebrate tonight." Richard Harrison nodded, a genuine and welcome warmth returning to his eyes like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Lead the way, Olivia. I cannot think of a single better way to spend a Friday evening than dining with my top regional finance manager." We walked back into the dining room together. I cleared away the red folder and the forged loan documents, setting them aside on the kitchen counter without ceremony. I took my rightful, undisputed seat at the head of the long glass table. Richard sat to my right, Jamal to my left, and the legal team filled in the remaining seats. We poured the expensive red wine, raised our glasses high, and toasted to the end of a very long, very eventful, and ultimately very successful week. The food tasted absolutely extraordinary, seasoned perfectly with the sweet and unmistakable flavor of total justice. It has been exactly 12 months since the heavy brass deadbolt clicked shut on my front door, locking the toxicity permanently out of my life. The rented velvet staging furniture was hauled away the very next morning, and I spent the entire weekend methodically restoring my home to itself. I unpacked the woven baskets Barbara had so openly despised and placed the framed photographs of my late father prominently and proudly on the mantel where they had always belonged. The house finally breathed again, and so did I, deeply and without reservation. Today, my life looks entirely and unrecognizably different. I am no longer the exhausted, hollow woman running on 3 hours of fragmented sleep and cheap gas station caffeine. I am sitting at the head of a massive mahogany conference table on the top floor of our corporate headquarters, looking out at a city that feels entirely within reach. Richard Harrison kept his word without hesitation. After reviewing my flawless and meticulous execution of the regional supply chain merger, he officially promoted me to Vice President of Finance. I no longer need to audit small local businesses on my weekends simply to make ends meet. I manage an entire national division. I set my own hours, and I come home every single evening to a sanctuary that belongs completely and exclusively to me and my children. The financial disaster Derek had attempted to leave behind took several months of aggressive, persistent litigation to fully untangle. But with Jamal's relentless expertise and iron determination, we secured an absolute and comprehensive victory. The federal government moved swiftly and decisively. They did not merely arrest my ex-husband. They actively seized his hidden offshore cryptocurrency accounts before the unregulated servers could launder a single additional dollar of the stolen funds. Through a strict court-ordered restitution mandate, the bank was fully reimbursed for the fraudulent home equity loan, and the terrifying lien on my property was permanently and completely erased from every record. Even more deeply satisfying was the recovery of the twins' college fund. The $45,000 Derek had stolen from Leo and Mia was retrieved in full and deposited directly back into their protected 529 savings plans, along with an additional mandatory penalty fee that Derek was forced to forfeit as part of his sentencing. My children's future is completely secure and safely, permanently shielded from their father's monumental and destructive ego. As for Derek himself, there was no grand app launch. There was no billionaire angel investor waiting eagerly to post his bail. Faced with the mountain of irrefutable forensic evidence Jamal and the district attorney had compiled, his high-priced defense attorney quietly abandoned ship within weeks. The public defender assigned to his case strongly and directly advised him to accept a plea deal rather than risk a lengthy public trial he was statistically guaranteed to lose. Derek is currently serving a mandatory 5-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. He spends his days working in the prison laundry facility, earning pennies per hour, finally and unavoidably forced to understand the real value of actual physical labor. Barbara, completely unable to maintain even the faintest illusion of high society grandeur without her golden child to project it onto and fund it, was forced to confront her own stark financial reality. She downsized into a cramped, outdated one-bedroom apartment on the other side of the state. She sends me angry, misspelled letters every few months demanding that I deposit money into Derek's commissary account so he can purchase premium snacks. I simply drop them directly into the paper shredder, unopened and unread. Kelsey, the self-styled fake co-founder, scrubbed her entire social media presence clean following a formal interrogation by federal agents and vanished completely into obscurity, as though she had never existed at all. Looking back honestly on the years I spent working myself down to the bone, while Derek played the role of the misunderstood, underappreciated genius, I have come to understand that my biggest mistake was not the money I lost. It was the vast, precious mental real estate I allowed him to occupy in my mind. I had convinced myself that being a truly supportive partner meant carrying his dead weight indefinitely. I had genuinely believed that if I simply worked a little harder, made fewer demands of my own, and stayed quietly and gratefully in the background, he would eventually step up and become the man our family so desperately needed. But some people simply do not want to grow. They want a comfortable, frictionless place to remain small. And they will drain your life force without hesitation or remorse to fund that comfort indefinitely. True independence is not simply about having your own bank account or holding the sole title on a property deed. It is about recognizing your own intrinsic, non-negotiable value and absolutely, unconditionally refusing to allow anyone to diminish it. It means never shrinking yourself, concealing your ambitions, or deliberately downplaying your success just to make a lazy and profoundly insecure man feel tall by comparison. I spent 5 long years playing the submissive, invisible bookkeeper so Derek could perform the role of visionary in front of an audience that was never truly watching. The moment I stopped playing the part he had assigned me, his entire carefully manufactured world collapsed, and my real, authentic, fully realized life finally and irrevocably began. If you are reading or listening to this and you find yourself constantly exhausted, financially depleted, and emotionally hollow because you are carrying a partner who flatly refuses to walk on their own 2 feet, I need you to hear this clearly and completely. You do not owe anyone your future. You do not owe anyone your peace. Start quietly and systematically organizing your exit strategy today. Protect your assets, gather your evidence, lean on the people who genuinely, unconditionally support you, and stop setting yourself on fire just to keep someone else comfortable in the dark. Thank you for listening to my story. If this journey resonated with you in any way, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more honest, unfiltered stories of women who chose themselves and took their absolute power back. Let me know in the comments below if you have ever had to cut dead weight out of your own life in order to finally reach your full potential. Remember, you hold the pen to your own life story. Make absolutely certain you write yourself an ending that you truly and completely deserve. Olivia's journey perfectly and powerfully illustrates a painful but vital truth we consistently fail to recognize. We often mistake self-sacrifice for genuine support. For years, she played the exhausting role of a depleted, submissive partner in order to protect Derek's extraordinarily fragile ego. She deliberately and methodically dimmed her own brilliant corporate success so that his fabricated tech founder persona could occupy center stage, unchallenged. The primary lesson here is both undeniable and urgent. Shrinking yourself to make an insecure partner feel tall does not save the relationship. It only breeds deep, corrosive resentment and actively enables their most toxic and self-destructive behaviors. This narrative illuminates with uncomfortable precision exactly how financial manipulation thrives in the shadows of assumed submission. Derek weaponized Olivia's tireless hard work, draining her children's college fund and forging her signature on federal bank documents. Because he firmly and arrogantly believed she would continue to absorb the damage, just as she always had before. However, Olivia's ultimate victory was secured not through emotional outbursts or reactive confrontation, but by quietly, patiently mastering the facts and using them with precision. She understood her legal rights. She secured her financial assets. She leveraged the undeniable, irrefutable power of a thoroughly documented paper trail. She grounded her entire response in forensic accounting and federal law, refusing to allow her emotions to lead when clarity was what the moment demanded. Genuine empowerment requires radical and unflinching honesty about who you are and what you are truly willing to tolerate within the boundaries of your own life and home. Olivia only fully reclaimed her life when she stopped performing the diminished role Derek had authored for her and stepped entirely and unapologetically into her actual authority. Her story stands as a stark and necessary reminder that your potential should never be held hostage by someone else's stubborn, willful refusal to grow. You cannot fix a partner who views your success as a personal threat and your bank account as their private funding source. Take an honest, courageous look at your own relationships today. Actively ensure that you are never sacrificing your financial security, your hard-won achievements,